Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. It's strange how the wilderness can change in a matter of minutes. One moment, it's calm, peaceful, almost serene. The next, something shifts. The air becomes heavier, the sounds seem sharper, and everything you thought you knew about your surroundings suddenly feels unfamiliar. That's exactly how it happened to me that night, when the forest went from being my sanctuary to a place of unnerving fear. I was used to the quiet, used to the stillness that settled over the trees when the sun dipped below the horizon. Being a forest ranger for 8 years, I've seen and heard it all: rustling leaves, snapping twigs, the calls of distant animals. But that night something felt off. Something was wrong. The cabin where I stayed during my patrol shifts was nothing special. Just a small wooden structure nestled deep in the national park, far from any real civilization. No electricity, just a few lanterns, a small stove, and the comforting warmth of a crackling fire. It was October, and the nights were growing colder. The fire inside was the only thing keeping the frost from creeping into my bones. I remember sitting there at the little table, writing up some routine reports, the fire casting flickering shadows along the walls. Outside, the wind was picking up, whistling through the trees like it always did. I didn't think anything of it at first. Just another typical night in the wilderness, but then the footsteps started. At first, I thought I was imagining them, just faint, barely audible over the wind. The kind of sound that makes you stop and strain your ears, unsure if you've heard anything at all. But they came again. Slow, deliberate, heavy. I froze, pen hovering above the paper. The sound was distinct now. Something or someone was walking outside the cabin. I closed the logbook quietly, trying not to make a sound, my senses suddenly on high alert. It could have been a deer, maybe a bear. Both are common in this part of the forest. But something about the pattern of those steps made my skin crawl. They weren't fast, like an animal startled by a noise. They were slow, calculated, almost human. The cabin has no windows facing the direction of the sound, just the small front window that overlooks the clearing. To see what was out there, I'd have to step outside. My hand instinctively reached for the rifle I kept leaning by the door. I hadn't had to use it in months, but the weight of it in my hand was comforting now. I stood there, just inside the door, listening. The footsteps stopped. I waited, holding my breath. The wind howled outside, but beneath it, I could hear the faintest crunch of leaves, something shifting its weight. It was right outside the cabin. Slowly, I unlocked the door and cracked it open, just a sliver, enough to peer through. The fire from inside spilled out, casting a dim light across the porch and the clearing beyond. I saw nothing. Just darkness, the trees swaying in the wind, and the faint outline of the trail that led back into the dense woods. Then there was a low, guttural sound, not an animal's growl, but something close. A deep, throaty rumble that vibrated through the air, sending a shiver down my spine. I had heard the calls of wolves, bears, and even mountain lions in my years working the park, but this sound, this was different. It was almost like a voice, a sound trying to be something human, but missing the mark in some unsettling way. I shut the door softly and locked it again, the click of the deadbolt sounding far too loud in the quiet. My heart pounded in my chest as I backed away from the door, rifle in hand, moving toward the center of the room where the fire crackled. The shadows it cast seemed darker now, as if the warmth of the flame was fighting to push back something unseen. For a moment, everything was silent, just the crackling of the fire and the soft whistle of the wind. Then came the steps again. This time, they were louder, closer, Something was circling the cabin, its footfalls slow and deliberate, crushing the dried leaves and underbrush beneath its weight. I couldn't see it, but I knew it was there. Moving, watching. The steps stopped again, this time on the far side of the cabin, near the back wall. My eyes darted to the walls as if I could somehow see through them, as if staring hard enough would reveal whatever was lurking just beyond. But all I had was the sound, that heavy, rhythmic sound of something walking, waiting, and then the doorknob rattled, my breath hitched, and I gripped the rifle tighter. The door, solid and thick, creaked ever so slightly as the knob twisted again, this time harder. My mind raced. Who or what was out there? A person? An animal? Neither possibility brought any comfort. I raised the rifle, pointing it toward the door, unsure of what I'd do if it opened. My finger hovered over the trigger, my pulse racing in my ears. But after a few long, agonizing seconds, the rattling stopped. Silence. The air was thick with tension, as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting. Then the footsteps started again, moving away from the door, back around the cabin. It was still there, still circling, still watching. I could hear it move, slower now, almost as if it knew I was listening, knew I was terrified. A bead of sweat rolled down the side of my face, despite the cold. Suddenly, a loud crash shook the walls of the cabin. It came from the back, as if something massive had slammed against the wood. I jumped, instinctively backing away toward the far corner of the room, my eyes fixed on the walls. The thing outside let out another sound, a mix between a growl and a grunt, low, menacing, frustrated. It was testing the cabin, trying to get in. The fire flickered as another crash echoed through the room. Whatever it was strong. My mind raced with all the possibilities. Bears, wolves, even a rogue moose, but none of those animals behaved like this. None of them walked like that. None of them made sounds like that. The next few minutes dragged on, filled with silence broken only by the occasional scrape of something against the walls. It wasn't leaving. It was waiting, testing my resolve, seeing if I'd make a mistake and step outside. I didn't know what to do. I paced the small cabin, every nerve on edge, rifle clutched tightly in my hands. My mind kept going back to that first sound, those heavy, deliberate footsteps. They weren't animalistic, not entirely. There was something almost intentional about them, as if it, whatever it was, knew I was inside, knew I was scared. The crashes grew softer, less frequent, as if the thing outside was losing interest or simply waiting for a better moment. The fire was beginning to die down, and I knew I couldn't let it go out completely, not if I wanted to maintain any sense of control over the situation. I moved toward the fireplace, keeping one ear toward the door. As I fed the flames with more wood, I heard it again, the sound of something brushing against the windows, slow and deliberate. It was close. I could almost feel its presence, lurking just beyond the fragile walls of the cabin. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the sound stopped. I held my breath, waiting for another crash, another growl, another rattling of the doorknob, but there was nothing. The night outside seemed unnaturally still, as if the forest itself had gone quiet, holding its breath with me. Minutes passed. The fire crackled softly, casting long shadows across the cabin. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat loud in the eerie silence. And then, from somewhere deep in the forest, I heard it. A low, distant howl, not quite an animal, not quite human. It sent a chill down my spine, but this time it was far away. Whatever had been out there was gone. For now, I didn't sleep that night. I kept the fire burning, kept my rifle close, and listened. Listened for any sign that it was coming back. But the forest remained still, as if it, too, was recovering from the encounter. When the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, I cautiously stepped outside. The clearing looked the same, but the ground told a different story. There, in the soft dirt around the cabin, were enormous, Deep footprints. They circled the cabin, leading into the woods and disappearing into the dense brush. I never saw what made those prints, but I knew one thing for certain. Whatever it wasn't done with me. Not yet. Story 2. The howl that pierced the night wasn't like anything I'd heard before. It wasn't a wolf, wasn't a coyote. It was something different. Something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up and my hand instinctively reach for the radio at my hip. But I hesitated. What would I even say? My name's Sarah, and I've been a forest ranger here in the Cascade Mountains for going on 5 years now. I thought I knew every sound these woods could make. Turns out I was wrong. It started as a typical night shift at my remote outpost. The late October air had a bite to it, and the wind whispered through the pines, bringing with it the earthy scent of decaying leaves and damp soil. I was settling in for a long, quiet night of paperwork and occasional patrols when I first heard it, a low, guttural sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I stepped out onto the porch of my cabin, flashlight in hand, and swept the beam across the tree line. The light caught nothing but swaying branches and dancing shadows. Still, that feeling of being watched, of something out there in the darkness, wouldn't leave me. "Get a grip, Sarah," I muttered to myself, trying to shake off the unease. "I've dealt with black bears, mountain lions, and the occasional lost hiker. Whatever this was, I could handle it. Right?" I decided to do a quick perimeter check, more to settle my nerves than anything else. The crunch of pine needles under my boots was oddly comforting. As I made my way around the cabin, everything seemed normal until I reached the back of the structure. There, in the soft earth near the tree line, was a set of prints that stopped me dead in my tracks. They were huge, easily twice the size of a man's foot, and distinctly bipedal. My mind raced through possibilities, bear standing on its hind legs. Some idiot playing a prank with fake Bigfoot feet, but the depth of the impressions spoke of immense weight and the stride length. It was all wrong. I crouched down, shining my flashlight on the prints, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. That's when I heard it again, that same haunting howl, but closer this time, much closer. My head snapped up, and for a split second, I caught a glimpse of something moving between the trees. Something tall, dark, and definitely not human. My heart pounding, I scrambled back to the cabin, slamming and locking the door behind me. I grabbed my radio but hesitated again. What would I even report? That I saw a shadow? That I found some weird footprints? I'd be the laughing stock of the ranger station. Instead, I decided to document everything. I grabbed my laptop and started typing furiously, recording every detail I could remember. The sound of the howl, the size and shape of the prints, the fleeting glimpse of whatever it was I saw. As I typed, I became aware of a rhythmic sound outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but it was too regular, too deliberate. Thump, 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 like footsteps. Heavy footsteps circling the cabin. I held my breath, straining to listen. The footsteps paused, and then there was a new sound, a deep, rumbling growl right outside my window. I froze, not daring to move, barely daring to breathe. Something scraped against the side of the cabin, and I could have sworn I heard sniffing, like some enormous creature was trying to catch my scent. Minutes passed like hours as I sat there, paralyzed with fear. Eventually, the sounds moved away, fading into the distance. But I knew it wasn't over. Whatever was out there, it knew I was here, and I had a sinking feeling it would be back. The rest of the night was a blur of anxious vigilance. I alternated between peeking out the windows and huddling in the center of the room, away from any potential entry points. I kept the lights off, not wanting to draw attention to myself, but the darkness only fueled my imagination. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of leaves outside became a potential threat. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, I finally allowed myself to relax a little. Creatures of the night, no matter how terrifying, usually retreat with the coming of day. Still, I waited until the sun was fully up before venturing outside. In the harsh light of day, everything looked different. The forest that had seemed so menacing in the darkness now looked peaceful, almost welcoming, but the evidence of the night's events remained. I circled the cabin, camera in hand, documenting everything. The footprints were still there, even more distinct in the morning light. I placed my boot next to one for scale and snapped a picture. The contrast was shocking. As I continued my investigation, I found more signs of the night's visitor. Deep claw marks scored the bark of a nearby pine tree, far higher than a bear could reach. Tufts of coarse, dark hair caught on a bramble bush. I collected samples of everything, my scientific training kicking in despite my lingering fear. I spent the morning compiling all the evidence, preparing a report that I knew would sound insane to anyone who hadn't experienced it firsthand. But I had to report it. Whatever was out there, it wasn't just a threat to me. Hikers, campers, other rangers, they all needed to be warned. As I finished up my report, a call came in over the radio. A hiker had gone missing in my sector overnight. Search and rescue was being mobilized. My blood ran cold as I realized the implications. I joined the search party, my mind racing with possibilities. Was the missing hiker connected to what I'd experienced? Had they encountered the same creature? As we spread out through the forest, I found myself jumping at every sound, half expecting to see a towering, shadowy figure lurking behind every tree. Hours passed with no sign of the missing hiker. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees, a sense of dread settled over me. We couldn't stay out here after dark, not with that thing roaming the woods. Just as we were about to call off the search for the day, one of the other rangers shouted. We all converged on his location, pushing through dense underbrush. What we found made my stomach churn. It was a backpack, torn to shreds and covered in dirt. Personal items were scattered around, a water bottle, a crushed cell phone, a tattered map, and there, leading away from the scene, was a trail of those same massive footprints I'd seen outside my cabin. The other rangers were baffled, tossing around theories about bear attacks or mountain lions. But I knew better. I'd seen those prints. I'd heard that howl. Whatever had done this wasn't any normal predator. As we carefully collected the evidence and called in our findings, I wrestled with whether or not to share what I knew. Would they even believe me? Or would they dismiss it as the ravings of an overworked, overstressed ranger? In the end, I decided to keep my full experience to myself, at least for now, but I vowed to get to the bottom of this. Whatever was out there in those woods, whatever had taken that hiker, I was going to find out the truth. As we made our way back to the ranger station, the sun sinking below the tree line, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The forest seemed to close in around us, shadows deepening, branches reaching out like grasping fingers. I shivered, not just from the cooling air, because I knew that somewhere out there, hidden in the gathering darkness, something was waiting. Something that didn't belong in any scientific textbook or wildlife guide, something that had marked this forest and me as its territory. And as the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, a lone howl echoed through the trees, a sound that I now knew all too well, a sound that promised this was far from over. Story 3. The moment I saw those footprints, I knew I wasn't alone. They were too large, too deep, and far too fresh for comfort. I'd been hiking these trails for years, but never had I encountered something like this. Whatever made those prints wasn't just passing through, it was close, and it was watching me. The day had started out like any other solo hike. The air was crisp, the autumn leaves crunching beneath my boots as I followed the familiar trail that wound through the forest. It had rained the night before, leaving the ground damp and soft. The perfect conditions for catching a glimpse of the wildlife that roamed these woods. I was excited, Fall was my favorite time to hike, and the stillness of the forest was always a welcome escape from the chaos of everyday life. I had packed light as usual, just enough supplies for a day hike and my trusty camera slung over my shoulder. There was something peaceful about being out here alone. No distractions, no noise, just me and the wilderness. By the time I reached the lake, the sun was high in the sky, casting long shadows across the glassy water. It was one of those remote spots that hardly anyone knew about, off the beaten path, secluded, perfect. I dropped my pack by the water's edge, took a long drink from my canteen, and sat down on a fallen log to soak in the view. For a while, everything was perfect. The gentle lap of the water against the shore, the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze. It was the kind of tranquility I craved. But then I saw them, the footprints. At first, I didn't think much of them, just some tracks in the mud a few feet away from where I sat. Maybe a deer had passed through earlier, but when I stood up and took a closer look, my stomach dropped. These weren't deer tracks. They were massive, the kind of tracks you'd expect from a large bear, maybe, but even then something was off. They weren't shaped like bear prints. They were more human, only larger, much larger. And there were only two massive barefoot impressions, side by side, as if something had stood there, watching the lake. I crouched down, inspecting the prints more closely. The toes were distinct, pressed deep into the mud, as though the creature had been standing there for a while. The heel was wide, almost the size of my entire hand. My breath hitched in my throat. Whatever had made these prints had to be huge. My first instinct was to tell myself it was a prank, some hunter or hiker messing around, trying to spook anyone who might come across them, but there was no one out here, not this deep into the woods, and the rain last night would have washed away anything older than a few hours. These prints were fresh, too fresh. I stood up, scanning the tree line, suddenly hyper-aware of how quiet everything had become. The birds had stopped chirping. The wind had died down. Even the lake seemed unnaturally still, as if the whole forest was holding its breath. A chill ran down my spine. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was overreacting, but as I looked at the size of those prints again, my heart raced. I had no idea what could have made them, but whatever it was big, and it was close. I decided to head back. Quickly gathering my pack, I slung it over my shoulder and started back down the trail, my eyes darting to every shadow, every movement in the trees. The sense of unease grew with every step. The trail felt different now. The light seemed dimmer, the forest more oppressive, as if it had closed in around me. After a few minutes, I found myself glancing back at the lake, expecting to see something standing there, watching me from the shore. But there was nothing. Just the quiet forest behind me and the distant sound of water lapping against the rocks. I forced myself to keep moving, though the uneasy feeling in my gut only intensified. The trail was slick with mud from the rain, making it difficult to walk quickly without slipping, but I pushed on, my boots sinking into the soft ground with every step. And then I heard it. A crack, like a branch snapping underfoot. I froze. It came from somewhere behind me, back toward the lake. My pulse quickened, and I turned slowly, my breath catching in my throat. The trail was empty. Nothing but trees and shadows. But I knew what I had heard. Something, or someone, was following me. I started walking again, faster this time, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Every few steps I glanced over my shoulder, but there was nothing. Just the faint rustling of leaves and the sound of my own footsteps, until I heard them again. Footsteps. They weren't mine. They were heavy, deliberate, matching my pace. When I sped up, they sped up. When I slowed down, they slowed down. It was like a game, and I was the prey. I broke into a jog, my breath coming in shallow gasps as I struggled to stay calm. My pack bounced against my back, and I could feel the sweat beading on my forehead, despite the cool autumn air. The forest seemed darker now, more sinister, and every shadow looked like it was hiding something. The footsteps quickened, closing the distance between us. Panic surged through me, and I broke into a full run, my boots slipping in the mud as I tore down the trail. Branches whipped at my face, but I didn't care. All I could think about was getting out of those woods, getting away from whatever was following me. But the thing wasn't letting up. It was right behind me, its footfalls growing louder, heavier. I could hear its breath now, a deep, rasping sound that sent chills down my spine. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't. I just had to keep running. The trail ahead curved sharply, leading into a denser part of the forest. I could barely see a few feet in front of me, the trees packed so tightly together that they blocked out most of the sunlight. But I didn't have a choice. I had to keep going. I rounded the corner, my legs burning from the effort, my lungs screaming for air. But as I did, I slipped. My foot caught on a root hidden beneath the mud, and I went down hard, skidding across the ground. Pain shot through my knee, but I barely registered it. All I could hear was the heavy breathing behind me, the footsteps growing closer. I scrambled to my feet, my hands slick with mud, and glanced back for the first time, and there, at the edge of the trail, stood a figure. It was huge, taller than any human should be, its broad shoulders and massive frame half hidden by the shadows of the trees. It was covered in dark, matted hair, its face obscured by the gloom. But its eyes, those eyes, glowed faintly in the dim light, locked onto me. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. For what felt like an eternity, we stood there, staring at each other. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing, but nothing fit. This thing, this creature, wasn't supposed to exist, and yet there it was, real, solid. Watching me, it didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, as if waiting for me to do something. Slowly, I backed away, my legs trembling beneath me. I didn't know what it wanted, but I knew I had to get out of there. My foot found the trail again, and I turned, bolting into the forest without a second thought. I ran blindly, not caring where the trail led, just needing to get away. The trees blurred past me, the wind whipping at my face, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. The creature's presence loomed in my mind, and every instinct in my body screamed at me to keep moving. After what felt like hours, the trees began to thin. The sunlight filtered through the branches, and I saw the outline of the trailhead ahead. Relief surged through me, and I pushed myself harder, my legs aching from the effort. When I finally burst out of the forest, I collapsed onto the gravel road, gasping for breath. My body was shaking, my mind racing, but I was safe. I had made it out. I don't know what I saw that day. I don't know what made those footprints or why it followed me. But as I sat there, staring back at the trail, I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't alone in those woods, and whatever was out there, it wasn't human. Story 4. The snap of a twig in the darkness can change everything. One moment, you're enjoying the serenity of nature, and the next, you're prey. That's how quickly it happened for us. I'm Mike, and what was supposed to be a romantic getaway with my girlfriend Jessica turned into the most terrifying night of our lives. We'd been planning this camping trip for months, eager to escape the chaos of city life and reconnect under the stars. Little did we know, we weren't alone in those mountains. It was a perfect late summer evening when we arrived at our campsite. The air was crisp, filled with the scent of pine and wildflowers. Jessica and I laughed as we set up our tent, playfully arguing over the best way to secure the poles. As the sun dipped below the tree line, we built a small fire and cuddled close, roasting marshmallows and talking about our future. "This is perfect," Jessica sighed, resting her head on my shoulder. "We should do this more often," I nodded, planting a kiss on her forehead. "Absolutely. Maybe next time we can try that remote spot near Crystal Lake." If only I knew then how those words would come back to haunt me. As the fire died down to embers, we retired to our tent, The sounds of the forest lulled us to sleep, the gentle rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl. It was peaceful, until it wasn't. I'm not sure what time it was when I first heard it. A sound so out of place it jolted me awake, the breaking of branches, heavy and deliberate, somewhere in the darkness beyond our tent. "Jess," I whispered, gently shaking her awake. "Did you hear that?" She stirred, blinking sleepily. "Hear what?" As if in answer, the sound came again. Closer this time. Something large was moving through the underbrush, circling our campsite. Jessica sat up, suddenly alert. "What is that? A bear?" I wish it had been. Bears, at least, were a known quantity. We had bear spray, and I knew the protocols for dealing with them. But this felt different. "I don't think so," I murmured, straining my ears. "The movement's all wrong for a bear." A low, guttural sound reached us then. Not quite a growl, not quite a groan. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard before, and it sent chills down my spine. Jessica clutched my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "Mike, I'm scared," she whispered. I tried to put on a brave face, but my heart was racing. "It's okay," I said, not believing it myself. "Let's just stay quiet. It'll probably move on." But it didn't move on. For what felt like hours, we sat frozen in our tent, listening to the thing outside as it circled us. Occasionally, we'd hear sniffing sounds, as if it was trying to catch our scent. Other times, there would be long periods of silence, broken only by the sound of our own ragged breathing. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the tent fabric, the sounds finally faded away. We waited, tense and alert, for another hour before I worked up the courage to unzip the tent. The morning air was cool on my face as I peeked out. At first glance, everything seemed normal. Our campsite looked undisturbed, the ashes of our fire a reminder of last night's peacefulness. But then I saw them, footprints, massive, unmistakably bipedal footprints circling our tent. "Oh my God!" Jessica breathed, looking over my shoulder. "What made those?" I shook my head, unable to form words. The prints were easily twice the size of my own foot, with clear impressions of toes and a strange, almost human-like arch. We packed up camp in record time, constantly looking over our shoulders. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming. As we shouldered our backpacks and prepared to hike out, a twig snapped in the forest behind us. We both whirled around, hearts pounding. There, just for a moment, I saw something that defied explanation. A tall, dark figure, covered in hair, standing between two distant trees. It was there for just a second before it melted back into the shadows. "Run," I said, grabbing Jessica's hand. And run we did. The hike that had taken us 3 leisurely hours the day before was now a frantic scramble. We crashed through underbrush, leapt over fallen logs, and splashed through shallow streams. All the while, I could swear I heard something keeping pace with us, just out of sight. About halfway back to the trailhead, we stopped to catch our breath. Jessica leaned against a tree, gasping for air. "Do you think we lost it?" she panted. Before I could answer, a rock clattered down the slope above us. We looked up in unison, and my blood ran cold. There, silhouetted against the morning sky, was a figure, tall, broad-shouldered, and definitely not human. It stood watching us for a moment, then turned and loped away with an eerily fluid grace. What the hell was that? Jessica's voice was barely a whisper. I shook my head, unable to process what I'd seen. "I don't know, but we need to keep moving." The rest of the hike was a blur of adrenaline and fear. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves had us jumping. By the time we reached my car, we were both shaking from exhaustion and terror. As we drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that our ordeal wasn't over, that somehow, whatever had stalked us in those woods had marked us. I caught Jessica looking back at the receding tree line, her face pale. "We can't tell anyone about this," she said quietly. "They'll think we're crazy." I nodded, gripping the steering wheel tightly. I know, but we know what we saw, what we heard. The drive home was silent, both of us lost in our thoughts. The rational part of my brain tried to come up with explanations. A bear walking on its hind legs, an elaborate prank, a shared hallucination brought on by fear and lack of sleep. But deep down I knew we had encountered something that defied explanation, something that shouldn't exist. In the weeks that followed, Jessica and I tried to put the experience behind us. We threw ourselves into work, avoided talk of camping or hiking, and tried to convince ourselves it had all been some sort of mistake. But the nightmares came. Night after night, I'd wake up in a cold sweat, the sound of heavy footsteps and inhuman growls echoing in my mind. Jessica admitted to having similar dreams. We started sleeping with the lights on, jumping at every unexpected sound. One night, about a month after our trip, I woke to find Jessica standing at our bedroom window, staring out into the darkness. "Jess," I called softly. "What's wrong?" She turned to me, her eyes wide. "I thought I saw something in the backyard, something big." I rushed to the window, my heart pounding. The yard was empty, bathed in moonlight. But there, at the edge where our lawn met the woods behind our house, was a single massive footprint pressed into the soft earth. "It found us," Jessica whispered, her voice trembling. "It followed us home." As I stared at that impossible print, a howl echoed from the distant forest, a sound I recognized all too well, a sound that promised our encounter in the mountains was just the beginning. I pulled Jessica close, feeling her shaking against me. "What do we do now?" she asked. I wish I had an answer for her. I wish I could say we called the authorities, that we moved away, that we found some way to protect ourselves. But the truth is, we're still here, living each day with the knowledge that something is out there, something that defies logic and science, something that has its eyes on us. Every hike in the woods, every camping trip, every late-night drive down a dark road, they'll never be the same. Because now we know the truth. The wilderness holds secrets, and sometimes those secrets have teeth and claws. As I write this, the sun is setting, casting long shadows across our yard, and in those shadows, I can't help but wonder, is it out there, watching, waiting? Will this be the night it decides to do more than just watch? One thing's for certain, I'll never again underestimate the power of a snapping twig in the darkness, because sometimes that small sound is all the warning you get before your world changes forever. Story 5. It started as the perfect escape. Just me, my best friend Matt, and the quiet solitude of the wilderness. We'd been planning this camping trip for months, desperate for a break from the daily grind, from the noise of the city. The trail we picked was deep in the mountains, a place few hikers ventured, and that was exactly what we wanted. Isolation, peace, and nature in its purest form. But what we found was something far from peaceful, something that still haunts me. It was late afternoon when we started on the trail, the sun low in the sky but still warm on our backs. The air was crisp, and the smell of pine and damp earth filled my lungs with every breath. It felt good to be out here, miles away from civilization, just the two of us, and the forest stretching endlessly ahead. Matt was a few steps ahead, his pack bouncing lightly with each stride. "This is the life, man," he called over his shoulder. "No emails, no phone calls, just us and the wild." I grinned. He was right. The sound of leaves rustling, birds calling in the distance. It was everything we'd been looking forward to. The quiet of the forest was like a balm, wiping away the stress and noise of the city. The trail itself was rugged but manageable, winding through dense woods and occasionally opening up to offer glimpses of the towering mountains above us. We were making good time, planning to set up camp by the lake about 6 miles in. We'd hiked more challenging trails before, and this one felt no different at first. But about 2 hours in, something changed. It was subtle at first, Just a feeling that crept up on me slowly, like a chill that crawls up your spine before you even realize you're cold. The forest had gone quiet, too quiet. "Hey, Matt," I said, my voice sounding too loud in the silence. "You notice anything weird?" He stopped and turned to look at me, raising an eyebrow. "Weird how?" I hesitated, trying to put it into words. "I don't know, it just feels off. Like, listen, there's no sound, no birds, no wind, it's just quiet." He tilted his head, listening. For a moment, his face showed nothing but calm, but then I saw a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He heard it too, or rather, he didn't hear anything at all. "Yeah, that is kind of strange," he admitted, his voice a little lower now, as if not wanting to disturb whatever had caused the sudden silence. We stood there for a minute, just listening, but the quiet pressed down on us, thick and unnatural. I tried to shake off the unease. It was probably nothing. Maybe the birds had just moved on to a different part of the forest. Maybe it was just one of those moments when everything stops for no reason. But then I heard it, a snap, like a twig breaking underfoot, somewhere off to the right. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. My head whipped in the direction of the sound, but I saw nothing, just trees and shadows. Matt heard it too. I could see the way his body tensed, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the forest. "Probably just an animal," he said, trying to sound casual, but his voice was tight. "Yeah, probably," I echoed, though my gut was screaming something different. The sound hadn't been quick, like a startled deer. It was slow, deliberate, like someone or something was moving through the underbrush, watching us. We kept walking, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I found myself glancing over my shoulder more than once, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. Every time I looked, I saw nothing but the thick woods and the shadows between the trees. But the sensation of eyes on my back never went away. Another snap, this time closer. We both stopped dead in our tracks, turning toward the sound. Still nothing. "Maybe we should pick up the pace," Matt suggested, and I nodded. There was no argument from me. We started walking faster, the quiet between us stretching longer and more tense. The sun was beginning to sink lower now, casting long shadows across the trail. The golden light filtering through the trees was dimming, and with it, my sense of calm. We needed to get to the lake and set up camp before nightfall, but the footsteps started following us. At first, I thought I was imagining it. The soft crunch of leaves behind us, almost in time with our own steps. I told myself it was just the sound of our movements echoing off the trees, that the eerie quiet was playing tricks on my mind. But then Matt stopped suddenly, his face pale. "Do you hear that?" he whispered. I nodded, my stomach dropping. The footsteps weren't ours. They were behind us, matching our pace, staying just far enough back that we couldn't see who or what it was. "Keep walking," Matt said, his voice tight. "Don't run. Not yet." We moved faster, but the footsteps behind us sped up too, always just out of sight. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the sweat beading on my forehead despite the cool air. My mind raced, trying to think of what it could be. A bear. A mountain lion. But no, bears don't stalk like this, and mountain lions are silent predators. This was different. Every nerve in my body was on high alert, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up as we moved through the forest. The sun was setting fast, and the trail was becoming harder to follow. The dense trees around us cast long shadows, and every step felt like we were sinking deeper into something dark, something dangerous. "Matt," I whispered, barely able to keep the fear out of my voice, "I think we need to run." He looked at me, his eyes wide, fear reflecting in them for the first time. He didn't argue. We took off, running down the trail as fast as we could, our boots pounding against the earth, our packs bouncing wildly behind us. The footsteps behind us exploded into a sprint. Whatever was following us was no longer trying to stay hidden. It crashed through the underbrush, the sound of branches snapping and leaves rustling growing louder, closer. My lungs burned as I pushed myself harder, the adrenaline coursing through me, but I could feel it gaining on us. I glanced over my shoulder, and for the briefest moment, I saw it. A figure, tall, dark, massive, moving through the trees with terrifying speed. It was too fast, too big, and the way it moved was all wrong. It wasn't human. It couldn't be. "Go, go, go!" Matt shouted, his voice cracking with panic. The trail ahead was barely visible now, the light almost completely gone. We were running blind, the forest a blur of shadows and fear. The creature behind us was relentless, its heavy footsteps thundering in my ears. I tripped, my foot caught on a root, and I went down hard, skidding across the ground. Pain shot through my ankle, and for a moment the wind was knocked out of me. I gasped, struggling to get back to my feet, my heart hammering in my chest. "Get up!" Matt yelled, grabbing my arm and hauling me to my feet. "Come on, man, we have to move!" I limped forward, every step sending a jolt of pain through my leg, but I didn't have a choice. I had to keep going. We had to keep going. We burst through the trees and into a small clearing, just as the last of the daylight faded. The lake was ahead, its surface still and black, reflecting the darkening sky. But there was no safety here, no shelter, just more wilderness and the thing that was chasing us. Matt turned, his eyes wild. "We can't outrun it." I shook my head, gasping for breath. "What do we do?" The crashing sound of the creature grew louder, closer. It was almost on us. "Into the lake," Matt said suddenly, his voice shaking. "Maybe it won't follow us into the water." We didn't have time to think. We sprinted toward the lake, my injured ankle screaming with every step. The cold water hit my legs like a shock, but I didn't stop. We waded deeper, the water rising up to my waist. Then my chest. Behind us, the trees at the edge of the clearing shook violently. The thing was there, just beyond the tree line, hidden in the darkness, but it didn't follow us into the lake. We stood there, waist deep in the freezing water, watching the shore, waiting. It watched us too, just beyond the trees. Silent now, waiting, and that's when I realized it wasn't just following us, it was hunting us. We spent the night in the lake, too afraid to leave the water. When dawn finally broke, we stumbled back to the trail, exhausted, soaked, and shaking. The thing was gone, or at least we didn't see it anymore. But the footprints it left behind on the shore, deep, massive, and inhuman, were a reminder. We were never alone out there, and whatever had chased us, it was still out there, waiting for the next unlucky hiker to wander too far into its territory. Story 6. The first scream echoed off the cavern walls, sending chills down my spine. The second one made my blood run cold. By the third, I knew we weren't alone in this mountain, and whatever was out there wasn't human. My name's Alex, and I've been an avid hiker for years. But nothing in my experience could have prepared me for what happened on that ill-fated trek through the Rockies. It was supposed to be a challenging but rewarding 5-day hike with my friends, Mark, Sarah, and Jess. Instead, it turned into a nightmare that still haunts me. We set out on a crisp autumn morning, the air filled with the scent of pine and the promise of adventure. The first 2 days were everything we'd hoped for, breathtaking views, invigorating climbs, and nights spent laughing around the campfire under a blanket of stars. It was on the third day that everything changed. The weather turned suddenly, violently. Dark clouds rolled in, bringing with them a deluge that turned the trail into a muddy, treacherous slope. We pushed on, hoping to reach the next designated campsite before nightfall. "Maybe we should turn back," Sarah suggested, shouting to be heard over the howling wind. Mark shook his head, rain dripping from his beard. "We've come too far." The ranger said there's a cave system up ahead. We can shelter there until this passes. I wish we'd listened to Sarah, but hindsight, as they say, is 20/20. We pressed on, the rain pelting us mercilessly. By the time we spotted the cave entrance, we were soaked to the bone and shivering. It was a yawning black maw in the mountainside, promising shelter from the storm. "Thank God," Jess muttered as we stumbled inside, shaking water from our clothes. The cave was deeper than we'd expected, stretching back into darkness. We set up camp just inside the entrance, where we could still see the grey light of the stormy day outside. As night fell, the storm intensified. Lightning illuminated the cave mouth in strobing flashes, followed by booming thunder that seemed to shake the very mountain. We huddled around our small camp stove, sipping hot tea and trying to laugh off our misfortune. That's when I first noticed the marks on the cave wall. "Hey, guys," I said, shining my flashlight on the rock face. "Look at this." Deep gouges ran along the wall, too uniform to be natural. They looked almost like claw marks. But they were huge, far larger than any animal I knew of. "Probably just erosion," Mark said, but I could hear the doubt in his voice. We tried to settle in for the night, the storm still raging outside. I drifted into an uneasy sleep, only to be jolted awake by a sound that didn't belong. At first, I thought it was the wind, but as I listened, my heart racing, I realized it was something else entirely. A low, guttural growl echoing from deep within the cave. I sat up, fumbling for my flashlight. "Guys," I whispered urgently, "wake up! Listen!" One by one, they stirred, confusion turning to fear as they heard it too. The growl came again, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of something large moving in the darkness beyond our camp. "What is that?" Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. Before anyone could answer, a scream pierced the air, high-pitched, inhuman, and terrifyingly close. We scrambled to our feet, huddling together as we faced the inky blackness of the cave's interior. "We need to get out of here," Jess said, already grabbing her pack. But as we turned toward the cave entrance, a massive shape loomed in the darkness, blocking our escape. In the flickering light of our headlamps, I caught glimpses of matted fur, glinting eyes, and teeth. God, those teeth! The creature let out another ear-splitting scream, and we did the only thing we could. We ran deeper into the cave. Heart-pounding, lungs burning, we sprinted through twisting tunnels, the sound of heavy footfalls echoing behind us. The beam of my headlamp bounced wildly, illuminating more claw marks on the walls, scattered bones on the floor. "There!" Mark shouted, pointing to a narrow crevice in the cave wall. "We can squeeze through there!" One by one, we forced ourselves into the tight space, the rough rocks scraping our skin. I went last, and just as I slipped into the crevice, I felt something grab at my ankle. I kicked wildly, hearing a snarl of frustration as I pulled free. We emerged into a smaller chamber, panting and trembling. The opening we'd come through was too narrow for the creature to follow, but we could hear it on the other side, growling and scratching at the rock. "What the hell was that thing?" Sarah gasped, her face pale in the beam of her headlamp. "I don't know," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "but we need to find another way out of here." We took stock of our situation. We had our packs with some food and water, our headlamps, and a basic first aid kit. But we were lost in an unexplored cave system, with no idea how deep we were or if there was another exit. And something was hunting us. "Okay," Mark said, taking a deep breath. "We need to stay calm and think this through. There has to be another way out." We decided to follow the airflow, hoping it would lead us to an exit. As we moved through the twisting passages, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every shadow seemed to move. Every echo sounded like footsteps. Hours passed, or maybe it was days. Time lost all meaning in the perpetual darkness of the cave. We rationed our food and water, knowing we had to find a way out soon. It was during one of our rest periods that we heard it again. That bone-chilling scream, distant but unmistakable. The creature had found another way into this part of the cave system. "Run!" I said, and we were off again, fear giving us a burst of energy we didn't know we had left. We ran blindly, taking turns at random, our headlamp beams bouncing crazily off the cave walls. The sounds behind us grew closer, the growls and screams mixing with the thunder of pursuit. Just when I thought we couldn't go on, Jess shouted, "Light! I see light!" Sure enough, there was a faint glow ahead. We pushed ourselves harder, hope giving us a second wind. The passage widened, the ceiling rose, and suddenly we burst out onto a narrow ledge on the mountainside. The storm had passed, and the world was bathed in the grey light of dawn. We gulped in the fresh air, relief flooding through us. But our reprieve was short-lived. A roar from the cave mouth behind us reminded us that we weren't safe yet. We turned to see a massive, hair-covered form emerge from the darkness. In the light of day, I could finally see our pursuer clearly, and the sight made my blood run cold. It was tall, easily 7 or 8 feet, with powerful limbs and a face that was a nightmarish blend of ape and man. Its eyes gleamed with an intelligence that was terrifyingly out of place on such a bestial form. "Go!" I shouted, snapping us all out of our stunned silence. We scrambled along the narrow ledge, loose rocks skittering down the sheer drop to our left. The creature followed, its massive form moving with a speed and agility that seemed impossible for its size. Just as I thought it would overtake us, the ledge widened into a sloping path. We ran down the mountainside, slipping and sliding on the loose scree. I dared a glance back and saw the creature hesitate at the edge of the tree line, as if reluctant to leave the cover of the forests and caves it called home. We didn't stop running until we reached the ranger station at the base of the trail, collapsing in exhaustion and babbling our story to the bewildered park staff. They organized a search of the area, but found nothing, no tracks, no signs of the creature we described. In the years since, I've tried to rationalize what happened. Maybe it was a bear, driven to unusual behavior by the storm. Maybe it was mass hallucination, brought on by fear and exhaustion. But deep down, I know the truth. There are things in this world that defy explanation. Creatures that lurk in the wild places where humans rarely tread. I've seen one, heard its screams, felt the brush of its claws. I don't hike anymore. The mountains have lost their allure, the forests their mystery. Because now I know that sometimes, when you venture into the wilderness looks back. And what you find there might just shatter everything you thought you knew about the world. As I sit here, writing this, I can't help but glance out the window at the distant mountains. And I wonder, not for the first time, if somewhere in those peaks, in the depths of an unexplored cave, something is looking back at me, remembering the prey that got away. Story 7. It was the kind of cold that clung to your skin, the type that made your breath freeze in the air before your face. I had dealt with many freezing nights as a forest ranger, but nothing prepared me for the unease that settled in my gut that night. It wasn't just the chill that kept me awake. It was the sound, a low, guttural growl, unlike anything I'd ever heard, echoed through the trees, making me question everything I thought I knew about these woods. I'd been assigned to patrol this section of the forest for years, deep in the Adirondacks, far from the usual tourist spots. It was late November, and the winter cold had already begun to settle in for good. My cabin was a small, one-room shack, barely enough space for a cot, a wood stove, and my supplies. It wasn't much, but it was enough for a few days of solitude while I made my rounds through the forest. That night, the wind howled outside, its icy fingers slipping through the cracks in the cabin's walls. The wood stove crackled softly, providing some warmth, but even the fire felt weaker than usual. I was bundled up in my sleeping bag, eyes closed, hoping sleep would come soon. My muscles were tired from the day's-long patrol, but my mind was too restless. It was then, just as I was drifting into that half-sleep, that I heard it. At first, I thought it was the wind playing tricks on me, a low, deep sound, carried on the breeze. But then it came again, closer this time, a grunt. Not the typical sound of a bear or deer moving through the woods, but something deeper, more primal. I sat up in my cot, straining to listen. The wind outside had died down, leaving only the creaking of the trees and the soft crackle of the fire. But underneath it, just barely audible, was the sound again. Another deep grunt, this time closer. Bears were rare this time of year, especially this deep into the cold season. Most of them were already hibernating. But even if it were a bear, this didn't sound right. It wasn't the aggressive growl of a territorial male or the rustling of a bear foraging. This was something else. I grabbed my flashlight and rifle, heart pounding in my chest as I swung my legs off the cot. The cold hit me immediately, biting through my thick layers of clothing, but the growing sense of dread did a better job of keeping me awake than the temperature. Slowly, I stood and moved toward the small window on the far side of the cabin. The light from the moon was dim, filtering weakly through the bare branches of the trees. The snow that blanketed the ground outside glowed faintly in the darkness. I swept the beam of my flashlight across the clearing in front of the cabin, but saw nothing, just the same familiar shapes of trees and shrubs swaying gently in the breeze. But then, another grunt, closer. I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Whatever it was coming closer, and it didn't sound afraid. It sounded like it was searching for something or someone. I backed away from the window, the weight of the rifle in my hands reassuring but not comforting. I'd dealt with dangerous animals before, sure. Angry moose, territorial wolves, even the occasional bear too stubborn to hibernate. But this felt different. It felt wrong. The next sound was unmistakable. A slow, heavy footstep. My blood turned to ice. It was right outside the cabin. I stood frozen in place, barely daring to breathe, listening as the footsteps continued, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. Each step was accompanied by that same low grunt, a sound that reverberated deep in my chest, setting my nerves on edge. I moved toward the door, rifle raised, my hand hovering over the latch. I knew I needed to see what it was, but every instinct screamed at me to stay inside, to lock the door and wait for it to pass. But I couldn't just sit there. Whatever was out there, I needed to know. With a deep breath, I unlocked the door and pulled it open just a crack, enough to see out, but not enough for anything to come in. The cold rushed in, biting at my face, but I ignored it, my eyes scanning the darkness. At first, there was nothing, just the quiet of the night and the faint howl of the wind through the trees. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Something large was moving through the shadows just beyond the edge of the clearing. I barely caught a glimpse of it, tall, hunched over, its silhouette blending into the darkness. But what I saw was enough to make my heart leap into my throat. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a moose, it wasn't anything I could recognize. It was moving on two legs. The creature stopped, standing just at the edge of the tree line. Its massive form partially obscured by the shadows. I couldn't make out its face, but I could see the outline of its shoulders, broad and hulking, and the way it stood, almost human, but not quite. I clutched the rifle tighter, my finger hovering over the trigger. Every muscle in my body was tense, my breath coming in shallow bursts as I waited for it to move. But it didn't. It just stood there, staring, or at least I assumed it was staring. I couldn't see its eyes, but I felt its gaze, like a weight, pressing down on me. Another grunt, low, deep, and almost curious. And then it stepped forward. The snow crunched under its weight as it moved closer, slowly, as if testing the ground, testing me. I could feel my pulse in my ears, my hands trembling as I raised the rifle a little higher. But I didn't shoot. Not yet. I wasn't sure what I was looking at, but I wasn't about to fire at something I didn't understand. It took another step, and then another, its massive frame looming larger with each movement. I could see more of it now, its arms, long and muscular, its head low, like it was sniffing the air. The creature was massive, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, and covered in dark fur that blended into the night. And then it stopped, just a few yards away from the cabin. I could hear its breathing now, slow, deliberate, a deep rumble that made my stomach twist in knots. It tilted its head slightly, almost like it was considering something, like it was trying to figure me out. My finger tightened on the trigger. But before I could make a decision, before I could pull the trigger or even lower the rifle, the creature let out a grunt, louder this time, more forceful, and then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it turned and lumbered back toward the trees. I watched, frozen in place, as it disappeared into the shadows, its massive form blending seamlessly into the darkness of the forest. The sound of its footsteps grew fainter and fainter until, finally, there was nothing but the silence of the woods. For a long time, I stood there, staring out into the night, my breath coming in shallow gasps, my heart still racing in my chest. The cold gnawed at my skin, but I barely noticed it. All I could think about was the thing I had just seen, the creature that had come so close, close enough to touch. Eventually, I closed the door and locked it, my hands still trembling. I stoked the fire, trying to push the cold and fear out of my bones. But sleep didn't come that night. I sat by the fire, rifle in hand, listening for any sound that might signal its return, but it never came back. By the time morning arrived, the woods seemed normal again. Birds chirped in the trees, and the wind rustled through the leaves like it always did. But I knew better. Whatever that thing was, it was still out there, watching, waiting, and I had the feeling that it wasn't done with me yet. Story 8. The shutter clicked, freezing the moment in digital eternity. It wasn't until later, reviewing the images in my tent, that I realized I'd captured something that shouldn't exist. Something that was getting closer with each frame. I'm John, a wildlife photographer with over a decade of experience, capturing nature's beauty and brutality. But nothing in my career could have prepared me for what I encountered in the remote wilderness of the Pacific Northwest. It was supposed to be a routine assignment, a 2-week solo expedition to document the recovery of wolf populations in the area. I'd done dozens of trips like this before, spending days or weeks alone in the wilderness with nothing but my cameras and my wits. I loved the solitude, the challenge, the connection with nature in its rawest form. The first few days were uneventful. I hiked deep into the backcountry, setting up camp in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. The air was crisp and clean, filled with the sounds of birds and the distant rush of a mountain stream. It was perfect. I spent my days tracking wolf signs, paw prints in soft mud, tufts of fur caught on branches, the remains of their kills. At night, I'd review my shots, plan the next day's route, and fall asleep to the haunting chorus of distant howls. It was on the 5th day that things started to feel off. I couldn't put my finger on it at first, just a vague sense of unease, like I was being watched. I'd felt similar things before. It's not uncommon when you're alone in predator country, but this was different, more intense, more personal. I was setting up for a long exposure night shot when I first saw it. A flicker of movement at the edge of my frame, barely caught by my peripheral vision. I swung my camera around, but whatever it was had vanished into the darkness. Shrugging it off as a deer or maybe a curious wolf, I returned to my original composition. But as I stood there in the stillness, finger poised over the shutter release, I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that was decidedly not wolf-like. It was deeper, more guttural, and it seemed to come from something much, much larger. My hand shook slightly as I triggered the shutter, the camera's sensor drinking in the pale moonlight. As soon as the exposure finished, I quickly packed up my gear and hurried back to camp, my headlamp beam jerking erratically as I constantly scanned the forest around me. Safe in my tent, I began reviewing the night's shots on my laptop. The first few were as expected, hauntingly beautiful landscapes bathed in moonlight, but then I saw it. In the background of one image, partially hidden behind a tree, was a shape. A large, humanoid shape covered in what looked like thick fur. My heart raced as I zoomed in, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It was blurry, indistinct, but undeniably there. Standing upright, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, with long arms and a broad, sloping forehead. "It can't be," I whispered to myself, my mind reeling. I quickly flipped to the next image in the sequence, taken about 10 minutes later from the same position. The shape was there again, but closer now, less obscured by the tree. I could make out more details: massive shoulders, a heavy brow, eyes that seemed to glow in the camera's flash. With trembling hands, I opened the final image of the set. The creature was there, in full view, and unmistakably looking directly at the camera. At me. I slammed the laptop shut, my breath coming in short. Panicked gasps. This couldn't be real. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, whatever you want to call it, these were myths, campfire stories, not something you actually encountered in the real world. But I knew what I'd seen. The images were right there on my hard drive, undeniable proof of something. Sleep was impossible that night. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves sounded like an immense creature moving through the underbrush. I lay awake, clutching my bear spray, straining my ears for any sign of approach. As the first light of dawn filtered through my tent, I made a decision. I had to get out of there. Whatever I'd photographed, whatever was out in those woods, I wanted no part of it. I'd hike out, alert the authorities, show them my photos, let them deal with it. I broke camp quickly, stuffing my gear haphazardly into my backpack. As I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The forest seemed unnaturally quiet, as if all the wildlife was hiding from something. Just as I was about to shoulder my pack and leave, I heard it. A deep, rumbling vocalization that was neither fully human nor fully animal. It came from the tree line directly behind my camp, no more than 50 yards away. Slowly, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat, I turned around. There, standing at the edge of the clearing, was the creature from my photographs. In the harsh light of day, it was even more terrifying. Massive and muscular, covered in reddish-brown fur, with a face that was a nightmarish blend of ape and man. And its eyes, God, its eyes were fixed directly on me, glinting with an intelligence that sent chills down my spine. For a long moment, we stared at each other, neither moving. Then, with deliberate slowness, I reached for my camera. If I was going to die out here, I was at least going to get undeniable proof of what killed me. As I raised the camera to my eye, the creature let out a roar that shook me to my core. Then it charged. I'd like to say I stood my ground, that I got the shot of a lifetime. But the truth is, I ran. I ran like I'd never run before, crashing through underbrush, leaping over fallen logs, my camera banging against my chest as I fled. I could hear it behind me, moving through the forest with terrifying speed and agility. Branches snapped like twigs under its passage. Its breathing, heavy and ragged, seemed to fill the air around me. I don't know how long I ran. Time lost all meaning in the blind panic of flight. But eventually, I burst out onto a logging road, my legs giving out beneath me as I collapsed onto the gravel. As I lay there, gasping for breath, I realized the sounds of pursuit had stopped. Slowly, I raised my head and looked back the way I'd come. The creature stood at the edge of the forest, watching me. It made no move to follow me onto the open road. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. Then, with a final, rumbling growl, it turned and melted back into the shadows of the forest. I didn't wait around to see if it would change its mind. I staggered to my feet and started walking, following the road until I managed to flag down a passing logging truck. The driver, seeing my wild-eyed, disheveled state, didn't ask too many questions as he drove me back to civilization. In the days and weeks that followed, I tried to make sense of what had happened. I showed my photos to the authorities, to wildlife experts, to anyone who would listen. Some were fascinated, others skeptical. There were investigations, expeditions into the area where I'd been, but nothing was ever found. The images themselves became the subject of intense debate. Some claimed they were the most convincing evidence of Bigfoot ever captured. Others insisted they must be an elaborate hoax. As for me, I knew the truth. I'd seen it with my own eyes, heard its roar, felt the ground shake beneath its feet as it charged. I don't go into the deep wilderness anymore. My cameras gather dust. My passion for wildlife photography extinguished by the terror of that encounter, because now I know that sometimes, when you point your lens into the unknown, something looks back, and what you capture might just change everything you thought you knew about the world. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself looking at those photos again, the sequence of images, showing the creature getting closer and closer. And I can't help but wonder, if I'd stayed out there just a little longer, taken just one more shot, what would I have seen? What would have seen me? In the end, I'm left with more questions than answers. But one thing I know for certain, the wilderness holds secrets, and some of them have teeth and claws. And sometimes the most dangerous predator in the forest is the one we've convinced ourselves doesn't exist. Story 9. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip, a chance for my best friend Megan and me to unwind, escape the noise of the city, and find some peace in the middle of nowhere. The forest around us was thick and untouched, the river running beside our camp clear and cold. Everything felt calm, normal, until that moment when I looked down into the water. And that's when I saw it, the face staring back at me. We had chosen this spot because it was isolated, a hidden gem deep within the national forest. No marked trails, no other campers, just us and the wilderness. It was Megan's idea. She's the adventurous type, always pushing me to step out of my comfort zone. And to be honest, the idea of spending a few days disconnected from the world, with nothing but the sound of the river and the wind in the trees, sounded perfect. The first day went as planned. We hiked in early, setting up camp near the river, where the water was shallow but fast-moving, with smooth stones at the bottom, perfect for wading. The trees surrounding us created a natural canopy, dappling the ground with sunlight that made everything feel warm and inviting. After we set up the tent and gathered wood for the night, we decided to relax by the river, letting the cool water wash over our feet as we sat on the bank. Megan was busy skipping stones across the surface, her laughter echoing through the trees as she broke her personal record. "I'm telling you, Laura, you'll never beat 6 skips," she teased, tossing another stone effortlessly. "Watch me," I laughed, grabbing a flat rock and winding up. The stone hit the water with a dull plop, sinking immediately. Or maybe not. We both chuckled, the kind of easy laughter that comes from years of friendship. The afternoon sun was starting to dip lower, casting a golden glow across the river. It was peaceful. Perfect. That's when I decided to get up and refill our water bottles. The river was our only source of water, so we'd brought a portable filter to make sure everything was safe to drink. I grabbed the bottles, walking a little farther downstream where the current was calmer, and knelt by the edge of the water. The cold stung my hands as I dipped the first bottle in, letting the water flow into it. That's when I saw it, a reflection in the water. At first, I thought it was my own face, distorted by the rippling surface. But as I looked closer, my heart stopped. It wasn't my reflection. A face stared up at me from beneath the surface, pale, gaunt, eyes wide and unblinking. The features were hollow, as if the skin had been pulled tight over bone, and the eyes, those eyes were too wide, too dark, like 2 black holes staring straight into me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. For a moment, I thought I was hallucinating, that my tired mind was playing tricks on me, but then the face moved, its lips parting slightly as if trying to say something, the water around it barely disturbed. I scrambled backward, my heart hammering in my chest. The water bottle slipped from my hands, floating away downstream as I stumbled to my feet. "Laura, you okay?" Megan's voice cut through the silence, startling me. I whipped around, my eyes wide, my mouth dry. She was standing a few feet away, a curious look on her face. I glanced back at the water, expecting to see the face again, but it was gone. The river was just the river, the surface smooth and undisturbed. I thought I saw something, I stammered, feeling ridiculous even as I said it. Megan frowned and walked over to me. What do you mean, like a fish or something? No, not a fish. It was... I hesitated, unsure of how to explain it without sounding insane. I thought I saw a face in the water. Megan blinked at me for a moment, then burst out laughing. A face in the river. Okay. Now I know you've been out here too long. You're imagining things. I forced a laugh, trying to shake off the unease. Yeah, maybe. Must have been a trick of the light. But as we made our way back to the camp, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The face. The way it had stared up at me. The way its lips had moved as if it wanted to speak. I kept telling myself it was just the water playing tricks on my eyes, that it was nothing to worry about. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The rest of the evening was quiet. Megan seemed to forget about my strange encounter and went on chatting happily as we cooked dinner over the fire. I tried to focus, to enjoy the moment, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every rustle in the trees, every whisper of wind made me jump. As the night crept in, the temperature dropped, and we decided to turn in. The fire crackled softly as we crawled into the tent, zipping up the door to keep the chill out. Megan was asleep within minutes, her soft snores filling the silence. But I couldn't sleep. I lay there, staring at the roof of the tent, listening to the sounds of the forest. The river, which had seemed so peaceful during the day, now felt ominous, its steady rushing like a constant reminder of what I'd seen. I told myself over and over that it was nothing, just a figment of my imagination, but the image of that face wouldn't leave my mind. Hours passed, or at least it felt like hours. The fire outside had died down to embers, casting faint flickers of light against the tent walls. I was just beginning to drift off when I heard it. A splash. My eyes snapped open, and my body tensed. I listened, holding my breath. Another splash, louder this time, like something or someone was moving in the river. I sat up, careful not to wake Megan, and unzipped the tent as quietly as I could. The cold night air hit me immediately, and I shivered as I stepped out into the dark. The moon was barely a sliver in the sky, casting weak light across the forest, but I could still make out the outline of the river just beyond the camp. The splashing continued, rhythmic and steady, as if something was walking through the water. I crept closer, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in short, shallow bursts. The fire was almost out, casting just enough light for me to see the riverbank. The water gleamed in the moonlight, and I could see ripples spreading across the surface, but there was no sign of anything in the water. But then, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement. Something pale and shadowy just beneath the surface, moving slowly against the current. The shape drifted closer, and my stomach twisted with fear as I recognized it. The face. It was back, just beneath the surface of the water, staring up at me with those same hollow eyes. But this time, it was clearer, closer. I could see the sharp angles of its jaw, the thin line of its mouth, barely moving as the water flowed over it. And then, slowly, it began to rise. The water parted as the figure pushed itself upward, its shoulders breaking the surface. My breath caught in my throat as the rest of its body emerged, tall and thin, the water pouring off its skin like it didn't belong there. Its eyes locked onto mine, and I was frozen in place, unable to move, unable to even scream. The thing stepped closer to the shore, its feet silent on the rocks. It opened its mouth, and a low, raspy sound escaped, like a whisper carried on the wind. Why? It breathed, its voice barely audible over the sound of the river. I stumbled backward, finally finding my voice. "What do you want?" I whispered, my hands shaking. The figure stopped at the edge of the water, its head tilting slightly, as if considering my question. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it began to sink back into the river, the water closing over its head until there was nothing left but the quiet rush of the current. I stood there, staring at the spot where it had disappeared, my body trembling with fear and cold. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fire, stoking the flames to keep the darkness at bay, watching the river, waiting for the face to return. But it never did. When morning finally came, I told Megan we needed to leave. She asked why, but I couldn't bring myself to explain. I didn't want to see that face again. We packed up and hiked out as quickly as we could, but even now, as I sit here back in the safety of my apartment, the memory of that face haunts me, and I can't help but wonder if it's still out there, waiting for someone else to see it. Story 10. The first time I saw the eyes glowing in the darkness, I told myself it was just a deer. The second time, I wondered if it might be a bear. By the third time, I knew I was lying to myself. Whatever was watching me from the shadows of the forest was something else entirely. My name is Emily, and I'm a wildlife biologist specializing in predator behavior. I've spent years studying wolves, bears, and mountain lions in their natural habitats, but nothing in my scientific training could have prepared me for what I encountered in the remote wilderness of the Pacific Northwest. It all started as a routine research expedition. I was conducting a long-term study on the impact of climate change on predator populations in the area. The work involved spending weeks at a time in isolated regions, setting up camera traps, collecting data, and observing animal behavior. It was challenging, often lonely work, but I loved every minute of it, or at least I did until things took a terrifying turn. The first signs that something was amiss were subtle. I'd been in the field for about 2 weeks when I started noticing unusual patterns in the local wildlife. The deer and elk, normally abundant in the area, seemed scarce. When I did spot them, they were skittish, more on edge than usual. At first, I attributed it to normal variations in behavior, or maybe the presence of a new predator in the area. It was during my 3rd week that I found the first carcass. I was checking my camera traps when I stumbled upon the remains of a large elk. But this wasn't a normal predator kill. The carcass had been torn apart with incredible force, bones snapped like twigs. What struck me most was the lack of feeding. Whatever had killed this elk hadn't done it for food. As I knelt to examine the carcass more closely, I felt a prickle on the back of my neck, that primal instinct that tells you you're being watched. I slowly stood and turned, scanning the tree line. That's when I saw them for the first time, 2 eyes, reflecting the light of my headlamp, staring at me from the shadows. They were too high off the ground to be a wolf or a mountain lion, and the wrong color for a bear. I called out, thinking it might be another researcher or a lost hiker. But there was no response, just those eyes, unblinking, watching me. After what felt like an eternity, they disappeared into the darkness. That night, back at my camp, I pored over my field guides and research papers, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. But nothing fit. The kill pattern didn't match any known predator in the region, and those eyes, they haunted my dreams. Over the next few days I found more carcasses. Each kill was more violent than the last. Animals torn apart with a strength that defied explanation. And always, that feeling of being watched. Sometimes at night, I'd wake to the sound of heavy breathing just outside my tent, or the crack of branches under an enormous weight. I knew I should leave, report my findings, and let a larger team investigate, but the scientist in me couldn't let it go. I had to know what was out there. I set up more camera traps, focusing on the areas where I'd found the kills. Most of the time, they captured nothing unusual, just normal forest wildlife. But then, one morning, I retrieved a memory card that changed everything. The first few images were normal, a deer grazing, a raccoon scurrying by. Then at 2:17 a.m., something huge moved in front of the camera. The image was blurry, but I could make out a massive, hair-covered form. It was clearly bipedal, standing upright at a height that had to be over 7 feet. The next image, taken seconds later, showed it closer to the camera. I could see a face that was neither fully human nor fully animal, with deep-set eyes that seemed to glow in the camera's infrared flash. My hands shook as I stared at the image. This couldn't be real. Bigfoot, Sasquatch, these were myths, not real creatures. But the evidence was right there on my screen. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my tent, my tranquilizer gun across my lap, jumping at every sound. As the first light of dawn broke, I heard a twig snap just outside. Holding my breath, I slowly unzipped the tent flap and peeked out. There, not 20 feet away, stood the creature from my photos. It was even more imposing in person, easily 8 feet tall, with powerful muscles rippling under its thick, reddish-brown fur. Its face was a disturbing blend of ape and man, with a heavy brow and deep-set eyes that looked unsettlingly intelligent. For a long moment, we stared at each other. I felt like a rabbit caught in the gaze of a wolf, my heart pounding so hard I was sure it could hear it. Then, slowly, deliberately, it took a step toward me. I'd like to say I stood my ground, that my scientific curiosity overcame my fear, but instinct took over. I scrambled out of the tent and ran, leaving everything behind. I crashed through the underbrush, branches whipping my face, roots threatening to trip me at every step. Behind me, I could hear the creature in pursuit, moving through the forest with a speed and agility that seemed impossible for its size. I don't know how long I ran. Time lost all meaning in the blind panic of flight. But eventually, I burst out onto a logging road, my legs giving out beneath me as I collapsed onto the gravel. As I lay there, gasping for breath, I realized the sounds of pursuit had stopped. Slowly, I raised my head and looked back the way I'd come. The creature stood at the edge of the forest, watching me. It made no move to follow me onto the open road. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. Then, with a final, rumbling vocalization that was neither fully human nor animal, it turned and melted back into the shadows of the forest. I didn't wait around to see if it would change its mind. I staggered to my feet and started walking, following the road until I managed to flag down a passing vehicle. The driver, seeing my wild-eyed, disheveled state, didn't ask too many questions as he drove me back to civilization. In the days and weeks that followed, I tried to make sense of what had happened. I showed my photos to colleagues, to wildlife officials, to anyone who would listen. Some were fascinated, others skeptical. There were investigations, expeditions into the area where I'd been, but nothing conclusive was ever found. The scientific community largely dismissed my story. My photographic evidence was deemed inconclusive, possibly the result of a bear standing on its hind legs, or an elaborate hoax. My career took a hit as I became known as the biologist who chased Bigfoot, but I know what I saw. I've spent years studying predators, observing their behavior, understanding their kills. What I encountered in those woods was something else entirely, something that straddled the line between man and beast, between myth and reality. I don't go into the deep wilderness anymore. My research now focuses on safer, more acceptable topics, but I can't forget what I saw out there. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself looking at those photos again, and I can't help but wonder, is it still out there watching from the shadows? And if so, what else might be lurking in the wild places of the world, just beyond the reach of our understanding? In the end, I'm left with more questions than answers. But one thing I know for certain, the wilderness holds secrets, and some of them have teeth and claws. And sometimes, the most dangerous predator in the forest is the one we've convinced ourselves doesn't exist. As a scientist, I was trained to question, to seek evidence, to remain skeptical. but as a human being, I know what I experienced. And I can't help but feel that there's more to our world than what we can explain with our current scientific understanding. Something is out there in the woods, watching and waiting. And maybe, just maybe, it's watching you right now. Story 11. I've heard a lot of strange noises while camping deep in the wilderness, snapping branches, the scurrying of small animals, the occasional eerie call of an owl. But nothing, and I mean nothing, compared to the howls I heard that night. It wasn't the kind of howl that makes you think of wolves or coyotes. No, this was something different, something far more chilling. And once I heard it, I knew I'd never forget the sound. I'd been camping solo for years, and it was something I prided myself on. There was a peace in being alone out there, miles from any road or human voice. It was just me, the forest, and the open sky. This particular trip had started no differently. I had pitched my tent in a remote section of the forest, miles away from the nearest trail. It was the kind of place you couldn't find on a map unless you knew where to look, hidden in the folds of a forgotten valley, surrounded by thick trees and rolling hills. The first day had been perfect. I spent it hiking, gathering wood, and setting up camp by a small stream that ran through the valley. The water was cold and clear, and the air was crisp with the bite of early fall. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, I made a small fire and cooked a simple dinner. By the time darkness fully settled in, I was feeling the familiar sense of peace that always came with these trips. The stars were brighter than ever, like diamonds scattered across a black velvet sky. I sat by the fire for hours, just staring up at them, feeling small in the vastness of the world. There was something humbling about being out there, alone with nothing but the distant sounds of nature and the crackling of the fire to keep me company. But as the fire started to die down and I began to prepare for bed, something in the air shifted. It was subtle at first, just a slight change in the wind, a quiet that seemed to settle over the forest like a blanket. The usual sounds of the night, crickets, frogs, the occasional rustle of leaves began to fade, leaving only the soft crackling of the last embers of the fire. I brushed it off, thinking the night was just particularly still. But then I heard it, the first howl. It was distant, barely more than a whisper carried on the wind, but it made my skin prickle with unease. It wasn't the high-pitched yipping of coyotes or the familiar call of wolves. This was something lower, deeper, almost mournful, like a long, drawn-out wail that sent a chill straight down my spine. I stood up, suddenly alert, my heart starting to pound in my chest. I scanned the darkness beyond the light of the fire, but there was nothing. Just the dense wall of trees, their branches swaying slightly in the breeze. Then it came again, this time louder, closer. I felt a knot of fear tighten in my stomach. I knew the sounds of the forest. I knew what animals lived out here, but this didn't sound like anything I recognized. It was too low, too drawn out, and too wrong, like something that didn't belong. For a few minutes, I stood there, frozen, listening intently. The howl didn't come again. The forest was still, almost unnaturally so, as if everything was holding its breath, waiting. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild. Maybe it was just the wind playing tricks on me. I kicked some dirt over the fire, letting it smother itself out as I climbed into my tent. The air inside the tent was cold, and I pulled my sleeping bag tighter around me, trying to calm my nerves. I lay there for a long time, staring up at the roof of the tent, listening to the silence. The knot in my stomach didn't go away. My senses were on high alert, my ears straining for any sound, but all I could hear was the soft rustle of the wind through the trees and the distant gurgle of the stream. I was just starting to drift off when it came again, the howl. This time, it was close, too close. It cut through the night, long and low, like a sound pulled from the depths of something ancient. My entire body went rigid, my heart hammering so hard in my chest I thought it might burst. I sat up, my breath coming in shallow gasps as I listened. The howl wasn't like any animal I had ever heard. It was deep, resonant, and it seemed to carry an unnatural weight with it, like it was pushing through the trees, through the air, and directly into my bones. The sound made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, and I could feel cold sweat beading on my skin despite the freezing temperature outside. I grabbed my flashlight and rifle, my hands shaking as I fumbled to unzip the tent. I had no idea what I was dealing with, but I wasn't about to sit there in the dark and wait to find out. As I stepped out of the tent, the cold night air hit me like a slap in the face, but I barely noticed. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, sweeping across the trees, the underbrush, the stream. Everything looked the same, but the feeling in the air was different. It felt thick, heavy, like the forest was holding its breath. Then I saw it, just for a second. A shadow, massive and hulking, moving between the trees at the edge of the clearing. My breath caught in my throat. The thing was tall, much taller than any human, and it moved with a strange, deliberate slowness. I barely caught a glimpse before it disappeared behind the thick trunks of the trees. But the shape of it, the way it moved, it wasn't right. It wasn't natural. I backed away slowly, my heart racing, every instinct screaming at me to get out of there, but there was nowhere to go. The trail back to my truck was miles away, and hiking through the dense forest at night was a death sentence. The howl came again, louder this time, almost as if it was right in front of me. I swung the flashlight toward the sound, my fingers trembling on the rifle. But there was nothing, just the empty darkness and the sound of my own ragged breathing. I stood there, paralyzed, my mind racing. What was this thing? I had heard stories before, legends really, about creatures in the woods, things that lived deep in the wilderness where no human dared to go, but I had never believed them, until now. Another rustle, this time to my right. I whipped the flashlight toward the sound, but again there was nothing, just the trees swaying gently in the breeze. I backed up toward the tent, my mind racing. I didn't know what to do. Running felt like a bad idea, but staying here exposed felt worse. The howl came again, but this time it wasn't distant, it was right behind me. I spun around, the beam of my flashlight catching a glimpse of something just beyond the tree line. A massive figure, its eyes reflecting the light back at me, glowing faintly in the dark. My heart stopped. It was watching me. The creature didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel its presence, its intent. It was studying me, deciding what to do next. I didn't wait to find out. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight in my panic as I scrambled into the tent and zipped it up behind me. The flimsy nylon walls offered no real protection, but it was all I had. I sat there, clutching the rifle, my body trembling as I waited for something, anything. But there was only silence, deafening, crushing silence. For the rest of the night, I didn't move. I barely breathed, listening to every sound, every rustle. But the howls didn't come again. And by the time the first light of dawn crept through the trees, the creature was gone. I didn't wait around to see if it would come back. I packed up my camp as fast as I could, my hands still shaking, and hiked back to my truck without stopping. The entire way, I felt like I was being watched, like the thing was still out there, hidden in the shadows, waiting for me to make a mistake. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my gear in the back and sped down the dirt road, not looking back. I haven't been back to those woods since, and I don't plan to, because whatever made those howls that night, whatever was watching me from the trees, it wasn't an animal. It was something else, something that didn't belong, and it's still out there, waiting. Story 12. The first splash could have been a fish, the second, maybe a beaver. But when I saw that massive, dark shape gliding through the water, I knew we were dealing with something else entirely. Something that shouldn't exist in this remote mountain lake. My name's Tom, and I've been an avid fisherman for most of my life. I thought I'd seen everything the waters could throw at me. But that fishing trip to Lake Shadowmere changed everything I thought I knew about what lurks beneath the surface. It was supposed to be a relaxing weekend getaway with my buddies, Mike and Dave. We'd heard rumors about the monster trout in this secluded lake, tucked away in a hidden valley of the Cascade Mountains, the kind of fish that become legends in angling circles. We just never expected to become part of a very different kind of legend. We arrived at the lake late Friday afternoon, the September sun already dipping behind the towering pines that surrounded the water. The lake was a mirror reflecting the sky and mountains in perfect detail. It was breathtaking and eerily quiet. "Man, this place is something else," Mike whispered, as if afraid to break the silence. We set up camp on a small, pebbly beach, the only flat ground we could find near the shore. As dusk fell, we sat around the campfire, sharing stories and a bottle of whiskey, our excitement growing for the fishing to come. That night, I was awakened by a sound I couldn't quite place. A heavy splash, followed by what sounded like labored breathing. Thinking it might be a moose or elk in the shallows, I unzipped the tent and peered out. The full moon cast a silvery light over the lake, and that's when I saw it. A dark shape, much larger than any fish I'd ever seen, gliding just beneath the surface. For a moment, I thought I glimpsed something else too, a head rising briefly above the water before submerging again. I blinked, rubbing my eyes. Surely it was just a trick of the light, my mind playing tricks in the liminal space between sleep and waking. I zipped the tent back up and tried to go back to sleep, dismissing what I'd seen as a product of too much whiskey and an overactive imagination. The next morning dawned clear and crisp. As we prepared our gear for a day on the water, I debated whether to mention what I'd seen to the others. In the bright light of day, it seemed foolish, and I didn't want to spook them before we'd even cast our first line. We took our small, inflatable raft out onto the lake, marveling at the clarity of the water. You could see straight to the bottom in the shallows, the pebbles and sand as clear as if there were no water at all. For the first few hours, the fishing was incredible. We were pulling in trout bigger than any we'd ever seen, each catch met with whoops of joy and admiration. But as the day wore on, things started to feel off. The fish stopped biting altogether. The birds that had been calling from the shore fell silent, and there was a tension in the air, a feeling of being watched that I couldn't shake. "Hey, guys," Dave said, his voice low. "Do you see that?" He was pointing towards the center of the lake. At first, I didn't see anything. Then I noticed it, a series of ripples, moving against the wind, heading straight for our boat. "Probably just a big fish," Mike said. But I could hear the doubt in his voice. The ripples got closer, and with them came a sound. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from beneath the water itself. Our raft rocked as something massive passed underneath us. "What the hell was that?" Dave whispered, his face pale. Before anyone could answer, the water about 50 yards from our boat erupted. A huge, dark shape breached the surface, water cascading off its form. For a split second, I saw it clearly. A long, serpentine neck, a head that was a nightmarish blend of horse and lizard, and eyes. God, those eyes were filled with an intelligence that made my blood run cold. The creature crashed back into the lake, sending a wave that nearly capsized our small raft. We scrambled to stay upright, our fishing rods forgotten, as we stared in horror at where the thing had disappeared. "Row!" I shouted, grabbing an oar. "Get us back to shore!" We paddled frantically, our eyes darting around, trying to spot where the creature might surface next. The lake, so peaceful just moments ago, now felt like a death trap. We were about halfway to shore when we heard it again, that deep, resonant growl, closer this time. The water behind us started to churn. "It's coming!" Mike yelled, his voice cracking with fear. I glanced back and immediately wished I hadn't. The creature was surfacing again, its long neck rising out of the water like some prehistoric nightmare. It was gaining on us fast. In a panic, Dave stood up, trying to paddle harder. It was a mistake. The sudden movement rocked the raft, and before I could grab him, he toppled over the side. "Dave!" I screamed, reaching for him, but he was already being pulled under, the water around him frothing as if in some terrible struggle. Mike and I watched in horror as our friend disappeared beneath the surface. For a moment, everything was still. Then Dave's body shot out of the water, thrown into the air as if he weighed nothing. He landed with a sickening splash and didn't resurface. Shock gave way to survival instinct. Mike and I rowed harder than we ever had in our lives, our muscles burning, our breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind us, we could hear the creature moving through the water, chasing us all the way to shore. We hit the beach hard, the raft scraping on the pebbles. We scrambled out, running up onto dry land, not stopping until we reached our campsite. Only then did we look back. The lake was calm again, as if nothing had happened. But near the center, where we'd been fishing, a dark shape moved just beneath the surface, watching, waiting. We broke camp in record time, our hands shaking so badly we could barely tie our packs. Neither of us spoke. What was there to say? Our friend was gone, taken by something that shouldn't exist. The hike out was a blur of adrenaline and fear. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves had us jumping. We half expected the creature to come lurching out of the forest, chasing us even on land. When we finally reached my truck, we threw our gear in the back and sped away, not slowing until we hit the main highway. Only then did the reality of what had happened begin to sink in. What do we tell people?" Mike asked, his voice hollow. I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles white. "The truth," I said. "We tell them the truth." But of course, no one believed us. The authorities searched the lake but found nothing, no monster, no sign of Dave. They concluded he must have drowned, his body likely snagged on something at the bottom of the lake. As for our story about a creature, it was dismissed as a shared hallucination brought on by trauma and possibly tainted alcohol. Years have passed since that terrible day at Lake Shadowmere. Mike and I don't talk much anymore. Too many painful memories, too many unanswered questions. I haven't been fishing since. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself looking at maps of that remote valley, tracing the outline of the lake with my finger. I think about what's still in there, swimming in those dark waters. I wonder if it's alone or if there are more of them. And I can't help but think about Dave, about what his final moments must have been like. I know what we saw that day. I know it was real. And I know that sometimes the biggest monsters aren't the ones we imagine lurking in the depths. Sometimes they're right there, just beneath the surface, waiting for unsuspecting prey. So if you're ever up in the mountains and you come across a lake that's not on any map, a lake that's too quiet, too still, turn back. Don't let the promise of legendary fish lure you in, because in those remote waters, there are some things that are better left undisturbed. Some legends that should remain just that, legends. And if you do find yourself on those dark waters, and you see ripples moving against the wind, well, you'd better start rowing. Row like your life depends on it, because out there, in the wild places of the world, it just might. Story 13. The trees weren't supposed to bend that way. Nature has its rules, its patterns, but what we saw in that forest defied everything I thought I knew. By the time we realized the danger, it was already too late. My name is Lisa, and I've been a wilderness guide for over a decade. I've led hundreds of hikers through some of the most challenging terrains North America has to offer. But nothing in my experience could have prepared me for what happened on that ill-fated trip into the heart of the Olympic Peninsula. It was supposed to be a routine 4-day trek, challenging enough to give my clients a sense of accomplishment, but not so difficult that it would overwhelm the less experienced members of the group. There were 5 of them, Mark and Sarah, a middle-aged couple celebrating their anniversary, Tom, a college student on summer break, and the Johnsons, Emily and her teenage son Kyle, who were trying to reconnect after a tough year. We set out on a crisp September morning, the air alive with the promise of adventure. The first day was picture-perfect. Clear skies, moderate temperatures, and trails that wound through towering old-growth forests and alongside crystal-clear streams. As we made camp that evening, spirits were high. If only I'd known it would be our last night of peace. The trouble started on the second day. We'd veered off the main trail, taking a less traveled path that I'd heard led to some spectacular viewpoints. In hindsight, I should have known better than to trust second-hand information, but the allure of showing my group something few hikers ever saw was too strong to resist. As we pushed deeper into the forest, the atmosphere began to change. The cheerful chatter of birds fell away, replaced by an oppressive silence. The air grew thick and heavy, carrying a musty, almost rotten scent. But it was the trees that first tipped me off that something was very wrong. "Hey, Lisa," Tom called out, pointing to a massive cedar. "Is it normal for the branches to grow like that?" I followed his gaze and felt a chill run down my spine. The tree's branches were bent at unnatural angles, twisting back on themselves in ways that defied both gravity and biology. As I looked around, I realized it wasn't just this one tree. The entire forest around us seemed warped, the trees contorted into grotesque shapes. "I've never seen anything like this," I admitted, trying to keep the unease out of my voice. "Must be some kind of localized phenomenon. Let's keep moving." But as we pressed on, things only got stranger. We came across a clearing where the grass grew in perfect circles, each one a different shade of green. The rocks we passed were covered in symbols that looked almost like writing, but in no language any of us recognized. And all the while, that feeling of being watched intensified. By late afternoon, I had to admit we were lost. The trail had disappeared hours ago, and my GPS was on the fritz, showing our location as somewhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. As panic began to set in, we stumbled upon an old, dilapidated cabin. "And we should stay here for the night," Mark suggested, eyeing the darkening sky. "We can try to get our bearings in the morning." Every instinct I had screamed against it, but I couldn't deny the logic. We were lost. It was getting dark, and at least the cabin offered some shelter. If only I'd listened to my gut. As we settled in for the night, the atmosphere grew even more oppressive. The air inside the cabin was stagnant and cold, and no matter how many blankets we wrapped ourselves in, we couldn't seem to get warm. Strange noises kept us on edge, scratching sounds from the walls, and what sounded like whispers just on the edge of hearing. It was around midnight when Emily shook me awake, her face pale in the dim light of our lantern. "There's something outside," she whispered. I listened, and sure enough I could hear it, heavy footsteps circling the cabin, accompanied by a low, guttural breathing. It didn't sound like any animal I knew. "Everyone stay calm and quiet," I instructed, my heart pounding. "Whatever it is, it'll probably move on if we don't provoke it." But it didn't move on. For hours, we huddled together in terrified silence as the thing outside continued its patrol. Occasionally, it would pause by one of the boarded-up windows, and we'd hear that deep, rumbling breath as if it were scenting the air. Just before dawn, the noises finally stopped. We waited another hour before I dared to peek outside. What I saw made my blood run cold. The clearing around the cabin was surrounded by crude structures, stick figures and bizarre totems made of bone and sinew. They hadn't been there when we arrived. And there, in the soft earth, were footprints. They were huge, easily twice the size of my own, and distinctly bipedal, but they weren't human. The shape was all wrong, with long, curved claws at the end of each toe. "We need to leave," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Now." We packed up quickly, our earlier exhaustion forgotten in the face of this new terror. As we stepped outside, the stench hit us. A powerful, musky odor that made my eyes water. It was everywhere, as if the thing had marked its territory. We set off at a brisk pace, trying to put as much distance between us and the cabin as possible, but it quickly became clear we were being followed. Branches would snap behind us, and occasionally we'd catch glimpses of a large, dark shape moving through the trees. "Oh, what is that thing?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "I don't know," I admitted, "but we need to find a way out of these woods." As the day wore on, our pursuer grew bolder. The sightings became more frequent, and that musky odor grew stronger. We could hear its breathing, heavy and wet, always just behind us. It was Kyle who saw it clearly first. He had dropped behind slightly to retie his bootlace when he let out a terrified yell. We all turned to see him scrambling backwards, his face a mask of horror, and then I saw it too. Standing just beyond Kyle was a creature out of nightmare. It was huge, easily 8 feet tall, with a massive, barrel-shaped chest and long, powerful arms that nearly reached the ground. Its body was covered in thick, matted fur, and its face, its face was like some terrible fusion of man and beast, with a sloped forehead, deep-set eyes that glowed with malevolent intelligence, and a mouth full of sharp, yellowed teeth. For a moment, we all stood frozen, humans and monster, locked in a tableau of terror. Then the spell broke and we ran. We crashed through the underbrush, all thoughts of following a trail long forgotten. Behind us, we could hear the creature in pursuit, moving through the forest with a speed and agility that seemed impossible for its size. I don't know how long we ran. Time lost all meaning in the blind panic of flight. But eventually, mercifully, we burst out of the tree line and onto a paved road. A pair of startled hikers stared at us in shock as we collapsed onto the asphalt, gasping for breath. When we looked back, the creature was gone, melted back into the shadows of the forest it called home. But its eyes, I'll never forget those eyes, watching us from the darkness between the trees. The authorities didn't believe us, of course. They put our story down to mass hysteria, a shared delusion brought on by getting lost in the woods. There was no sign of the cabin we described, no twisted trees or bone totems. Even the photos we had taken earlier in the hike were gone, our phones and cameras wiped clean as if by some electromagnetic pulse. In the months and years that followed, I tried to make sense of what had happened. I researched cryptozoology, delved into local legends, even consulted with experts in fields ranging from biology to folklore, but I never found any satisfactory answers. I don't lead hikes anymore. I can't bring myself to go back into the deep woods, knowing what might be lurking in the shadows. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself poring over maps of the Olympic Peninsula, tracing the routes we might have taken, trying to pinpoint where we crossed over from our world into something else. Because that's what I've come to believe. We didn't just encounter some unknown animal species that day. We stumbled into a place where the rules of our reality don't quite apply, a pocket of wilderness that belongs to something older and stranger than humanity. So if you're ever hiking in the deep woods and you come across trees that bend in impossible ways, or smell a musky odor that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, turn back. Don't let curiosity lure you off the beaten path. Because out there in the wild places of the world, there are some trails that were never meant for human feet, and some creatures that should remain hidden in the shadows of legend. Story 14. The first howl sent shivers down my spine. The second made my blood run cold. By the third, I knew I wasn't hunting deer anymore. Something was hunting me. My name's Tom, and I've been a hunter for most of my 45 years. I thought I knew these woods like the back of my hand, but on that cold November night, under the eerie glow of a full hunter's moon, I learned that some things in the forest are better left undiscovered. It started as a routine hunting trip. I'd taken a week off work, eager to bag a big buck before the season ended. The forecast promised perfect hunting weather, cold and clear, with a full moon to light up the night. I packed my gear, kissed my wife goodbye, and headed deep into the Adirondacks, to a remote area I'd been eyeing on topographic maps. The first 2 days were uneventful. I saw plenty of signs, fresh tracks, droppings, and rubs on trees, but no shooter bucks. Still, I was enjoying the solitude, the crisp autumn air, and the vibrant colors of the changing leaves. Little did I know, things were about to take a terrifying turn. On the 3rd day, I decided to push further into the backcountry, following a promising game trail. As I hiked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The forest seemed too quiet, no birds singing, no squirrels chattering. Even the wind seemed to have died down, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake. By late afternoon, I realized I'd gone further than intended. The sun was sinking fast, and I knew I wouldn't make it back to my camp before dark. That's when I spotted the cabin. It was an old trapper's shack, weathered and sagging, half hidden by overgrown vegetation. But it was shelter, and with night falling fast, I didn't have many options. As I approached, that uneasy feeling intensified. There was something not quite right about the cabin. It took me a moment to realize what it was. Claw marks. Deep, savage gouges in the wood, as if something massive had tried to tear its way inside. They were old, partially healed over by time and weather, but unmistakable. I hesitated at the door, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But the temperature was dropping rapidly, and I could see heavy clouds rolling in. It was this or risk hypothermia trying to navigate unfamiliar terrain in the dark. The interior of the cabin was Spartan, a rusty wood stove, a rickety table, and a narrow cot with a moldy mattress. But it was dry and relatively warm once I got a fire going in the stove. I ate a cold dinner of beef jerky and trail mix, then settled in for the night, my rifle close at hand. I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by a sound that made my hair stand on end. It was a howl, but unlike anything I'd ever heard before. Not a wolf, not a coyote. It was deeper, more guttural, with an almost human quality that sent chills racing down my spine. I sat up, straining my ears in the darkness. For a long moment, there was nothing but silence. Then it came again, closer this time, and it was answered by another howl from a different direction. My heart was pounding as I moved to the window, peering out into the moonlit forest. At first, I saw nothing but shadows and swaying branches. Then a movement caught my eye. Something large was moving through the trees, just at the edge of my vision. I caught glimpses of shaggy fur, of a massive, hulking form that seemed to shift between running on all fours and standing upright. I stumbled back from the window, my mind reeling. This couldn't be happening. There had to be a rational explanation, but deep down I knew what I'd seen, what I was hearing, the legends of the Adirondacks, the stories old-timers told around campfires. They were real. Another howl split the night, so close it seemed to shake the very walls of the cabin. I snatched up my rifle, checking to make sure it was loaded. For what felt like hours, I stood there in the darkness, my weapon trained on the door, listening to the creatures circling the cabin. Occasionally, I'd hear sniffing sounds, as if they were trying to catch my scent. Other times, there would be scratching at the walls, testing for weaknesses, but they didn't try to break in. It was as if they were toying with me, enjoying my fear. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the grimy windows, the noises finally faded away. I waited, tense and alert, for another hour before I dared to open the door. The clearing around the cabin looked like a war zone. Deep furrows had been gouged in the earth, trees were marked with fresh claw marks, and tufts of coarse, dark hair clung to the bushes. And there, in the soft soil, were footprints. Massive prints, clearly bipedal, but with long, curved claws at the end of each toe. I knew I should leave, get out of these woods as fast as I could, but the hunter in me, the part that had always sought to understand the natural world, couldn't let it go. I had to know more, so I did something that, in hindsight, was incredibly foolish. I decided to track the creatures. The trail was easy to follow: broken branches, tufts of fur, and those unmistakable footprints leading deeper into the forest. As I moved, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being led, that the creatures were leaving this trail deliberately. The day wore on, the forest growing darker and more foreboding with each step. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers. More than once, I thought I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, but when I turned to look, there was nothing there. It was late afternoon when I found it, a clearing that looked like something out of a nightmare. The trees surrounding it were bent and twisted into unnatural shapes, forming a kind of barrier. Within the clearing were crude structures, stick figures, and bizarre totems made of bone and sinew. The ground was littered with bones, deer, bear, and others I couldn't identify. And there, at the center of it all, was a cave entrance, yawning, black, and ominous. The stench hit me then, a powerful, musky odor that made my eyes water. It was everywhere, marking this place as territory, as home. I knew I should turn back. Every instinct, every ounce of common sense I possessed was screaming at me to run, but I'd come this far. I had to see it through. With shaking hands, I turned on my flashlight and entered the cave. The beam of light seemed swallowed by the darkness, barely illuminating a few feet in front of me. The air was thick and heavy, filled with that musky scent. As I moved deeper, I saw more bones, more twisted sculptures, and on the walls, to my amazement, were paintings, crude images of bipedal creatures towering over stick-figure humans, hunting scenes, rituals, a history written in ochre and charcoal. I was so engrossed in the paintings that I almost didn't hear it. A low, rumbling growl coming from the depths of the cave. I swung my light towards the sound and felt my heart stop. There, not 20 feet away, stood one of the creatures. In the harsh beam of my flashlight, I could see it clearly for the first time. It was massive, easily 8 feet tall, with a thick, powerful body covered in shaggy, dark fur. Its face was a nightmarish blend of wolf and man, with a sloped forehead, deep-set eyes that glowed in the light, and a muzzle filled with sharp teeth. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, we stared at each other. I saw intelligence in those eyes, a cunning that went beyond mere animal instinct, and something else, anger. This was its home, its sanctuary, and I was an intruder. I don't remember dropping the flashlight. I don't remember turning and running. The next thing I knew, I was crashing through the forest, branches whipping my face, my lungs burning as I gasped for air. Behind me, I could hear the creature in pursuit, its howls echoing through the trees. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing at the base of a massive oak. As I lay there, certain these were my final moments, I heard it, the sound of a vehicle engine somewhere in the distance. With the last of my strength, I stumbled towards the sound. I burst out onto a logging road just as a truck was passing. The driver, a grizzled old man, took one look at my wild-eyed, bloodied state and wordlessly opened the passenger door. As we drove away, I looked back at the forest, and there, just for a moment, I saw it. The creature standing at the tree line, watching me. Then it melted back into the shadows, gone as if it had never been. The authorities didn't believe me, of course. They put my story down to hallucinations brought on by exhaustion and isolation. There was no sign of the cabin I described, no twisted clearing or cave full of bones. I don't hunt anymore. I can't bring myself to go back into the deep woods, knowing what's out there. Sometimes, on full moon nights, I find myself staring out at the forest behind my house, listening. And sometimes, carried on the wind, I hear a howl, a reminder that in the wild places of the world, there are some predators that were never meant to be understood, some hunters that should remain the stuff of legend. Story 15. The crackle of my radio startled me in the pitch-black forest. "Sarah, come in. Everything okay out there?" It was Dave, my supervisor, checking in from the ranger station. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves before responding. "All clear so far," I lied, my voice betraying a slight tremor. "Just doing my usual rounds." But nothing about this night was usual. The shadows seemed darker, the silence more oppressive, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I dreamed of becoming a park ranger ever since I was a kid. Growing up in a small town, nestled against the Cascade Mountains, I spent every spare moment exploring the wilderness. While other girls my age were obsessing over boy bands and makeup, I was identifying bird calls and learning how to track animals. So when I finally landed my dream job at Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest, I was over the moon. Sure, it was just an entry-level position, but I was determined to prove myself. I threw myself into every task, no matter how mundane. I wanted to show them I had what it took to be a real ranger. That's how I ended up volunteering for the night patrol. Most of the senior rangers avoided it like the plague. Long, lonely hours in the dark forest with only your thoughts for company. But I saw it as an opportunity. If I could handle the night shift, surely they'd see I was ready for more responsibility. I'd been doing the patrols for about a month, and while the darkness still made me uneasy at times, I was starting to feel more confident. I knew the trails like the back of my hand, and I'd encountered nothing more dangerous than the occasional curious raccoon. Tonight felt different, though. There was a heaviness to the air, an unnatural stillness that set my teeth on edge. I tried to shake it off as I made my way along the familiar path, my flashlight cutting a weak swath through the darkness. The first odd thing I noticed were the birds, or rather the lack of them. Usually, even at night, you could hear the soft hoots of owls or the rustling of smaller nocturnal birds. But tonight, there was nothing. Just an eerie silence that seemed to press in on me from all sides. I picked up my pace a little, chalking it up to nerves. That's when I heard it, a sharp crack, like a branch snapping under a heavy weight. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I swung my flashlight in the direction of the sound, but the beam only illuminated trees and underbrush. "Hello!" I called out, wincing at how small and scared my voice sounded. "Is someone there?" No response, just that oppressive silence. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. It was probably just a deer or something, nothing to get worked up about. I forced myself to keep walking, though I couldn't help glancing over my shoulder every few steps. That's when I saw it, just a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision. I whirled around, my flashlight beam dancing wildly across the trees. For a split second, I thought I saw something, a large, dark shape moving between the trunks, but it was gone so quickly I couldn't be sure. My breath came in short, sharp gasps as I fumbled for my radio. "Base, this is Sarah. I think there's something out here." Static was my only reply. I tried again, my voice rising in pitch. "Dave, anyone there? I need backup." Nothing but a harsh crackle of interference. Panic clawed at my throat as I realized how utterly alone I was out here, miles from the nearest road, with no way to call for help. I briefly considered firing my gun into the air, but quickly dismissed the idea. The sound would echo for miles in this stillness, and I had no idea what it might attract. I needed to get back to my cabin. It wasn't far, maybe a mile down the trail. I could make it if I hurried. I broke into a jog, my flashlight beam bouncing crazily in front of me. Every shadow seemed to move. Every rustle of leaves sounded like footsteps. I was so focused on the path ahead that I almost missed it. A flash of reflected light off to my left. I skidded to a stop, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. Slowly, I turned my flashlight in that direction. Two eyes stared back at me from the darkness. Not the soft brown of a deer or the yellow of a coyote. These were intelligent eyes, almost human, but not quite. They blinked once, and I caught a glimpse of something huge and fur-covered, moving in the underbrush. A scream built in my throat, but terror kept it locked inside. I ran, Blind panic drove me forward, branches whipping at my face as I crashed through the forest. I could hear it behind me, heavy footfalls and the snap of branches. Whatever it was big, and it was fast. I burst into a small clearing, my lungs burning as I gasped for air. My cabin was just ahead, safety. I sprinted for the door, fumbling with my keys as I reached it. The sound of pursuit was getting closer. Finally, the lock turned. I flung myself inside, slamming the door shut behind me. My trembling hands worked the deadbolt as something heavy crashed against the other side. The whole cabin shook with the impact. I scrambled backward, my eyes locked on the door. It shuddered again under another blow. Whatever was out there, it wanted in, and the flimsy wooden walls suddenly felt like tissue paper. My radio crackled to life, making me jump. Sarah, do you copy? What's your status?" Dave's voice had never sounded so beautiful. I snatched up the radio, my words tumbling out in a panicked rush. "There's something out here. It chased me back to the cabin. I need help." "Slow down," Dave said, his calm tone a stark contrast to my hysteria. "What do you mean, something? A bear?" "No," I said, my voice shaking. "It's bigger. It was on two legs. I saw its eyes, Dave. They were wrong." There was a long pause. When Dave spoke again, his voice had lost some of its assurance. "Okay, Sarah. I want you to stay put. Lock all the doors and windows. I'm sending a team out to your location. We'll be there in 30 minutes. Just hang tight." The pounding on the door had stopped, but I could hear something moving around outside. Heavy footsteps circled the cabin, pausing occasionally. I imagined those eyes peering in through the windows, searching for a way inside. I checked every lock, then retreated to the small bedroom at the back of the cabin. I grabbed my shotgun from the closet, loading it with shaking hands. The weight of it was reassuring, even though I wasn't sure it would do much good against whatever was out there. Time seemed to crawl. Every creak of the cabin's old boards made me flinch. Twice, I heard scratching at the walls, like something testing for weaknesses. I huddled in the corner, my shotgun clutched to my chest, and prayed for dawn. When headlights finally swept across the windows, I almost cried with relief. I heard car doors slamming, voices calling my name, but I didn't move until I heard Dave's familiar knock on the door. "Sarah, you in there? It's Dave and the team. You can come out now." I unlocked the door with trembling hands. Dave's concerned face was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. He took in my disheveled appearance and the white-knuckled grip I had on the shotgun. "Jesus, kid, what happened out here?" I opened my mouth to explain, but the words wouldn't come. How could I describe what I'd seen? Would they even believe me? As the sky began to lighten with the first hints of dawn, we searched the area around the cabin. We found tracks, huge, misshapen prints that didn't match any animal I knew. Deep scratches marred the cabin's walls, too high up to have been made by a bear. Dave pulled me aside as the others continued to search. "Listen, Sarah, I need you to keep quiet about what happened here tonight, at least until we figure out what we're dealing with." I nodded numbly, still struggling to process it all. "Whatever's out there," Dave continued, his voice low, "it's not the first time we've had reports, but we can't have people panicking, you understand?" I thought about those eyes in the darkness, the intelligence I'd seen there, the way it had hunted me. "Yeah," I said softly. "I understand." As we drove back to the main station, I couldn't help but look back at the forest. In the growing light, it looked so normal, peaceful even. But I knew the truth now. Something was out there, something that didn't belong. And I had a feeling this wouldn't be the last time our paths crossed. I may have dreamed of being a ranger all my life, but suddenly the forest didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a battlefield, and I wasn't sure if I was ready for the war to come. Story 16. I never should have ignored the warnings, the locals, the weathered danger signs, even my own instincts. They all told us to stay away from Blackwood Ridge. But Mike and I were young, in love, and drunk on that particular brand of invincibility that comes with both. We thought we knew better. We were wrong. "Come on, Lisa! This spot is perfect!" Mike called out, already shrugging off his heavy backpack. I lagged behind, taking in our surroundings. The small clearing was picturesque, I had to admit. Tall pines stretched towards a sky turning pink with the approaching sunset. A babbling creek cut through one edge of the clearing, promising fresh water and the soothing sound of rushing water to lull us to sleep. But something felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. But there was a tension in the air, like the forest was holding its breath. "I don't know, Mike," I said, hesitating at the edge of the clearing. "Maybe we should keep going, find somewhere a little more open." Mike looked up from where he was already unpacking the tent, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What are you talking about? This place is amazing. We've got water, shelter, and look." He gestured to a neat circle of stones nearby. "Someone's even left us a fire pit. It's perfect." I bit my lip, trying to articulate the unease crawling up my spine. "It's just, don't you think it's weird we haven't seen anyone else on the trail? The ranger said this was a popular route." Mike's face softened. He stood up and walked over to me, wrapping his arms around my waist. "Hey, that just means we have this beautiful spot all to ourselves. Isn't that what we wanted? A romantic getaway, just the two of us." I leaned into his embrace, letting his familiar scent and warmth chase away some of my anxiety. "You're right," I said, forcing a smile. "I'm just being silly." "That's my girl," Mike grinned, planting a quick kiss on my forehead. "Now come on, let's get camp set up before it gets dark." We fell into our usual routine, working together to pitch the tent and gather firewood. As the sun dipped below the tree line, Mike got a cheerful blaze going in the fire pit. The flames chased away the growing shadows, and I felt some of my earlier unease melt away. This was nice, peaceful. We roasted hot dogs over the fire and made s'mores, laughing and talking about nothing in particular. It felt good to be disconnected from the world. Just the two of us beneath a canopy of stars, slowly revealing themselves in the darkening sky. It was as we were getting ready for bed that we heard it. A long, mournful howl that echoed through the trees. I froze, my sleeping bag halfway unrolled. "Was that a wolf?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Mike cocked his head, listening. "I don't think so. Probably just a coyote. Nothing to worry about." But there was something in his tone that made me think he wasn't as confident as he was trying to sound. The howl came again, closer this time. It didn't sound like any coyote I'd ever heard. There was a depth to it, an almost human quality that sent shivers down my spine. "Maybe we should put out the fire," I suggested, eyeing the trees warily. "We don't want to attract any animals." Mike nodded, looking relieved to have something to do. He busied himself dousing the flames, while I retreated to the relative safety of our tent. I zipped myself into my sleeping bag, trying to convince myself that the nylon walls offered some kind of protection. Mike joined me a few minutes later, his face pale in the beam of his flashlight. "All secure out there?" he said with forced cheerfulness. "Nothing to worry about." We lay there in silence, both pretending to sleep while straining our ears for any sound from outside. The night seemed to press in around us, the darkness absolute beyond the thin barrier of our tent. Just as I was starting to relax, convinced that whatever had made that sound had moved on, we heard it. A snuffling noise, right outside the tent. Something large was moving around our campsite. Mike's hand found mine in the darkness, squeezing tight. I could hear his breathing, quick and shallow. Neither of us dared to move. The thing outside circled our tent slowly. I could hear twigs snapping under its weight, the rustle of the underbrush as it moved. Occasionally, there was a deep, rumbling sound, almost like a growl, but deeper, more guttural. I don't know how long we lay there, frozen in terror. It felt like hours. Eventually, the sounds faded, moving off into the forest. But sleep was impossible now. We spent the rest of the night huddled together, jumping at every little noise. As the first grey light of dawn filtered through the tent walls, Mike finally stirred. "I'm going to check outside," he whispered. "No!" I hissed, grabbing his arm. "What if it's still out there?" "We can't stay in here forever," he reasoned, "and we need to know what we're dealing with." Reluctantly, I let him go. I held my breath as he slowly unzipped the tent flap and poked his head out. A moment later, he let out a low whistle. "Lisa, you need to see this." Steeling myself, I crawled out of the tent. At first, everything looked normal. Our campsite was undisturbed, the ashes of our fire still in the pit where we'd left them. But then I saw what had caught Mike's attention: tracks, huge, misshapen prints pressed into the soft earth around our tent. They were vaguely foot-shaped, but far too large to be human, and there was something off about their shape. The toes were too long, ending in what looked like claw marks. What made those?" I asked, my voice shaking. Mike shook his head slowly. "I don't know, but whatever it was, it's big, and it was right outside our tent last night." A twig snapped in the forest behind us. We both whirled around, but there was nothing there, just trees and shadows. "We need to get out of here," I said, already moving to break down the tent. "Now." Mike didn't argue. We packed up in record time, constantly glancing over our shoulders at the surrounding forest. Every rustle of leaves, every bird call made us jump. It wasn't until we were almost back to the trailhead that we allowed ourselves to relax a little. The familiar sight of our car parked at the ranger station was like a beacon of safety. "See," Mike said, forcing a laugh, "we made it. Probably just worked ourselves up over nothing last night." I wanted to believe him, but as we approached the car, my heart sank. All 4 tires were flat, huge gashes torn into the rubber. "Oh, God," I whispered, the full weight of our situation crashing down on me. We were miles from the nearest town, with no cell service, and something was out there, something that had followed us. A low, rumbling growl came from the tree line behind us. We turned slowly, our eyes widening in horror at what we saw. There, half hidden in the shadows of the forest, stood a figure. It was massive, at least 8 feet tall, and covered in shaggy dark fur. But it wasn't a bear or any other animal I recognized. It stood on 2 legs, its body a twisted parody of human form. Its face was the worst part, a mixture of wolf and man, with intelligent eyes that seemed to bore right through me. For a moment, we all stood frozen. Mike and I rooted to the spot in terror, the creature watching us with an almost curious tilt to its massive head. Then it took a step forward, and the spell broke. We ran. Abandoning our gear, we sprinted down the road, away from the thing that couldn't possibly exist. I could hear it behind us, heavy footfalls, and that bone-chilling growl growing closer with each passing second. I don't know how long we ran. My lungs were on fire, my legs screaming in protest, but pure adrenaline and fear kept us going. It wasn't until we heard the blessed sound of an approaching car that we dared to look back. The road behind us was empty. Whatever had been chasing us was gone, melted back into the forest, as if it had never existed. The driver of the car, an old man in a beat-up pickup, was understandably confused by the sight of 2 panicked hikers flagging him down in the middle of nowhere, but he was kind enough to give us a ride to the nearest town. As we sat in the back of his truck, huddled together and still shaking with residual fear, Mike turned to me. "Lisa," he said, his voice hoarse, What was that thing?" I shook my head, unable to find the words. How could I describe something that shouldn't exist, a creature out of nightmares and legends? "I don't know," I finally whispered, "but I never want to see it again." We reported what happened to the local sheriff, but I could tell from the look in his eyes that he didn't believe us. Just another couple of city folks spooked by the wilderness, he probably thought, but I know what we saw, what chased us. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear that howl in my dreams, a sound that doesn't belong in this world. And I wonder, is it still out there, waiting in the dark forests of Blackwood Ridge for its next unsuspecting victims? One thing's for certain, I'll never ignore the warnings again. Some places are meant to be left alone, some secrets of the wilderness better left undiscovered. I just hope others learn that lesson before it's too late. Story 17. I've spent my entire career capturing the beauty of nature, but nothing could have prepared me for what I saw that day. They say a picture is worth 1,000 words, but the images I captured in those remote woods left me speechless. And what happened after? Well, let's just say some things are better left unphotographed. The first light of dawn was just beginning to filter through the trees as I made my way along the overgrown trail. My camera gear weighed heavily on my back, but the promise of what lay ahead kept me moving. I'd heard whispers of an undiscovered waterfall deep in these woods, and I was determined to be the first to capture its beauty. As a nature photographer, I'd learned to trust my instincts, and right now, every instinct I had was screaming at me to turn back. There was something off about these woods. The birds were too quiet, the shadows too deep. But I pressed on, chalking it up to pre-shoot jitters. After a few hours of hiking, I found the perfect spot to set up my first camera trap. A small clearing with a well-worn animal trail running through it. I carefully positioned the motion-activated camera, making sure it had a clear view of the path. This ought to get some good shots of the local wildlife, I muttered to myself as I double-checked the settings. I spent the rest of the day setting up more cameras at strategic points throughout the area. By the time I made it back to my campsite, the sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. I fell asleep that night filled with anticipation for what my cameras might capture. The next few days passed in a blur of hiking, adjusting cameras, and taking my own photos of the stunning landscape. But as beautiful as the scenery was, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. More than once, I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, only to turn and find nothing there. On the fourth day, I decided to check the memory cards in my camera traps. The first few cameras yielded the usual results. Deer, raccoons, the occasional coyote. Nothing extraordinary, but still some nice shots. It was the last camera that changed everything. As I scrolled through the images, my heart nearly stopped. There, in crystal-clear detail, was a creature I had never seen before. It was large, easily 7 feet tall, with a body covered in thick, dark fur. But it wasn't a bear or any other animal I recognized. It stood on 2 legs, its posture unnervingly human-like. The face was what really got me. It was canine in structure, with a long snout and pointed ears. But the eyes were disturbingly intelligent. They seemed to stare right through the camera, right at me. I quickly ejected the memory card, my hands shaking. This had to be some kind of hoax, right? Maybe some local prankster in a really good costume. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. The way it moved in the sequence of photos, the sheer size and musculature, this was no man in a suit. I spent the rest of the day in a daze, unable to focus on my work. As night fell, I found myself jumping at every sound, imagining those eyes watching me from the darkness beyond my campfire. Sleep was impossible. I tossed and turned in my tent, my mind racing with possibilities. What exactly had I captured on film? Should I alert the authorities? Would anyone even believe me? A twig snapped outside my tent, jolting me fully awake. I held my breath, straining my ears. There it was again, the unmistakable sound of something large moving through the underbrush. With trembling hands, I reached for my flashlight. Part of me screamed to stay quiet, to not draw attention to myself. But I had to know. I unzipped the tent flap as quietly as I could and poked my head out. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating trees and shadows. For a moment, I saw nothing out of the ordinary. Then a flash of movement caught my eye. 2 eyes reflected the light, glowing an eerie yellow-green. They were at least 7 feet off the ground. I scrambled back into my tent, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst from my chest. The thing outside let out a low growl, a sound that was neither fully animal nor human. I don't know how long I lay there, paralyzed with fear. Eventually, the sounds of movement faded, but sleep was out of the question. As soon as the first light of dawn appeared, I packed up camp in record time. I needed to get out of these woods, to get somewhere I could process what I'd seen. The hike back to my car was a blur of paranoia. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves had me whirling around, half expecting to see that creature bearing down on me. But I made it back without incident. It wasn't until I was driving away, the woods receding in my rearview mirror, that I allowed myself to relax slightly. I had the photos, proof of something. I wasn't sure what exactly, but I knew it was big. My first stop was a small diner in the nearest town. I needed coffee, food, and a chance to look at those photos again in the light of day. Maybe I had imagined it all. Let my imagination run wild in the isolation of the forest. But as I plugged the memory card into my laptop, my hopes of a rational explanation evaporated. There it was, just as clear and terrifying as I remembered. A creature that should not exist, captured in perfect digital clarity. "You look like you've seen a ghost, honey," the waitress said as she refilled my coffee cup. "Everything okay?" I looked up at her, wondering how I could possibly explain what I'd seen. In the end, I just forced a smile and nodded. "Yeah, just a long few days in the woods. Thanks for the coffee." As she walked away, I noticed a flyer pinned to the bulletin board behind the counter. It showed a grainy photo of a similar creature, with the words, "Have you seen Bigfoot?" emblazoned across the top. My blood ran cold. Was that what I had encountered? But no. This thing had been different. More canine, like some impossible hybrid of wolf and man. I spent the next few hours researching on my laptop, fueled by cup after cup of coffee. Bigfoot sightings, werewolf legends, cryptid encounters. I fell down a rabbit hole of information. The more I read, the more convinced I became that what I had seen was real and that I might be in danger for having seen it. Just as I was considering my next move, my phone buzzed with a news alert. "Local hiker missing in Blackwood Forest." The headline read. My heart sank as I realized it was the same area I had just left. That settled it. I couldn't just sit on this information. I had to tell someone, had to warn people about what was out there. I gathered my things and headed for the local sheriff's office. As I walked in, I tried to rehearse what I was going to say in my head. But how do you tell someone you've got photographic evidence of a creature that shouldn't exist? The deputy at the desk looked up as I approached. "Can I help you, sir?" I took a deep breath. I need to report something I saw in the woods. Something dangerous." He raised an eyebrow. "Dangerous how? Did you see the missing hiker?" "No, not exactly," I said, fumbling with my laptop. "But I think I know what might have happened to him. I have photos." But as I opened my computer, my heart stopped. The screen was black, completely dead. No matter how many times I hit the power button, it wouldn't turn on. I don't understand," I muttered, panic rising in my throat. The photos were right here. The deputy was looking at me with growing suspicion. "Sir, have you been drinking? Or maybe took something while you were out in those woods?" I shook my head vehemently. "No, you don't understand. There's something out there, something not natural. I saw it. I photographed it." But even as the words left my mouth, I knew how crazy I sounded. The deputy's hand drifted to his radio, and I knew it was time to leave. "Never mind," I said quickly, gathering my useless laptop. "I'm sorry to have wasted your time." I practically ran from the station, my mind reeling. What had happened to my photos? To all my research, it was like something had wiped my computer clean. As I reached my car, a chill ran down my spine. In the reflection of the window, I saw a familiar shape standing across the street. Tall, fur-covered, with eyes that seemed to glow even in the daylight. I whirled around, but the street was empty, just a normal small town on a quiet afternoon. My hands shook as I unlocked the car and got in. I didn't know what was going on, but one thing was clear: I wasn't safe here. Whatever I had seen in those woods, it didn't want to be discovered, and it had followed me out. As I drove away, putting as much distance between myself and Blackwood Forest as possible, one thought kept running through my mind. Some things are better left unphotographed, and some secrets of the wilderness should remain hidden. But as I glanced in my rear-view mirror, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was too late for that. I had seen something I shouldn't have, and now it had seen me too. Story 18. I've always found solace in the wilderness, but that day in the Appalachian Mountains taught me that sometimes the wild doesn't want you there. The forest has its secrets, and some of them have teeth and claws. I went in searching for peace. I came out running for my life. The crisp mountain air filled my lungs as I stepped out of my car at the trailhead. It was early morning, the sun just beginning to peek over the eastern ridges, casting long shadows across the parking lot. I shouldered my backpack, double-checked my map, and set off down the trail with a spring in my step. This solo hike was exactly what I needed. After months of stress at work and a messy breakup, I craved the simplicity of putting one foot in front of the other, of challenging myself against nature rather than office politics. The Appalachian Trail had always been a dream of mine, and while I couldn't take 6 months off to do the whole thing, I'd carved out a week to tackle a particularly scenic section. The first few hours were blissful. The trail wound through dense forests of oak and hickory, occasionally opening up to reveal breathtaking vistas of the surrounding mountains. I paused often to take photos or simply breathe in the clean mountain air. This was why I came out here. To remember what really mattered, it was around midday when I first noticed something odd. The trail, which had been well maintained and clearly marked up to this point, suddenly became overgrown and difficult to follow. I checked my map, but according to it, I should still be on a popular section of the trail. Frowning, I pressed on, figuring it was just a stretch that hadn't been maintained recently. As the afternoon wore on, an unsettling feeling began to creep over me. The forest seemed different somehow. The trees grew closer together, their branches intertwining overhead to block out most of the sunlight. The cheerful bird song that had accompanied me earlier had faded away, replaced by an eerie silence broken only by the crunch of leaves under my boots. I paused, taking a swig from my water bottle as I surveyed my surroundings. Something wasn't right. According to my map and the mileage I'd covered, I should be approaching a popular overlook. But all I could see in every direction were trees, pressing in close like silent sentinels. "Hello?" I called out, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. "Is anyone there?" No response, not even an echo. A tendril of fear began to wind its way around my heart. I was an experienced hiker. I shouldn't be lost. I pulled out my phone, hoping to use the GPS, but there was no signal, of course. "Okay, Emma," I muttered to myself. "Don't panic. Just backtrack. You can't have strayed that far off course." I turned around, intending to retrace my steps. But as I looked back the way I'd come, my blood ran cold. The trail I'd been following had vanished, swallowed up by dense underbrush as if it had never existed. That's when I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I froze, my eyes darting around wildly, searching for the source. There was movement in the shadows between the trees, something large shifting just out of sight. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but years of outdoor experience held me in place. Running blindly through unfamiliar woods was a recipe for disaster. I needed to stay calm, to think. The growl came again, closer this time, and with it the unmistakable sound of heavy footfalls. Something was approaching, circling, getting closer with each passing second. My hand inched towards the small canister of bear spray attached to my belt. Whatever was out there, it was big. Too big to be a normal predator in these woods. A branch snapped off to my left. I whirled towards the sound, fumbling with the bear spray, and that's when I saw it. It emerged from the shadows like something out of a nightmare. Towering at least 8 feet tall, it was covered in shaggy, matted fur. But this was no bear. It stood on 2 legs, its body a twisted parody of human form. Its face was the worst part, a bizarre mix of human and animal features, with eyes that held an intelligence that sent chills down my spine. For a moment, we just stared at each other, me frozen in terror, the creature regarding me with what almost seemed like curiosity. Then it took a step forward, and the spell broke. I ran. Blind panic drove me forward as I crashed through the underbrush. Branches whipped at my face. Roots seemed to reach up to trip me. But I didn't slow down. I could hear it behind me, heavy footfalls and the snap of branches as it gave chase. I had no idea where I was going. All sense of direction was lost in the frantic flight. My lungs burned, my legs screamed in protest. But the sound of pursuit kept me moving. I burst through a thick stand of bushes and found myself at the edge of a steep ravine. I skidded to a stop, nearly losing my balance. The drop was at least 30 feet, with a fast-moving stream at the bottom, certain death if I fell. The creature's roar echoed through the trees behind me. I was out of options. Taking a deep breath, I began to scramble down the rocky slope as carefully as I could. Loose stones shifted under my feet, threatening to send me tumbling. I was about halfway down when I heard it emerge from the tree line above. I looked up and immediately wished I hadn't. The thing was perched at the edge of the ravine, its massive form silhouetted against the darkening sky. It let out another bone-chilling roar and began to descend after me with frightening speed. In my panic, I lost my footing. The world spun around me as I fell, bouncing off rocks and tree roots. I hit the water hard, the icy shock driving the air from my lungs. The current immediately swept me downstream, tumbling me over and over. I don't know how long I was in the water. It could have been minutes or hours. I was aware only of the desperate need for air and the bone-deep cold that seemed to penetrate my very soul. Just when I thought I couldn't hold on any longer, my hand brushed against something solid, a tree root extending into the water. With the last of my strength, I grabbed hold and pulled myself to the bank. I lay there, coughing and gasping, every inch of my body screaming in pain. But I was alive. Somehow, impossibly, I was alive. As my senses slowly returned, I became aware of voices, human voices, and flashlight beams cutting through the growing darkness. "Over here!" I tried to shout, but it came out as more of a croak. Still, it was enough. "I've found her!" a man's voice called out. "Over here, by the river!" Moments later, I was surrounded by people in search and rescue uniforms. They wrapped me in blankets, checked me for injuries, peppered me with questions I was too exhausted to answer. It wasn't until I was safely in the back of an ambulance, an IV dripping fluids into my arm, that I managed to find my voice. "There was something out there," I said to the EMT checking my vitals. "Something big. It chased me." He patted my hand reassuringly. "It's okay. You're safe now. Probably just got spooked by a bear." It happens to the best of us, but I knew it wasn't a bear. The memory of those intelligent eyes, that impossible form, was seared into my brain. I opened my mouth to argue, but stopped. What was the point? They'd never believe me. I barely believed it myself. In the days that followed, as I recovered in the hospital, I learned that I had been missing for nearly 48 hours. My car, found still parked at the trailhead, had triggered a search when I failed to return. According to the maps, I'd been found nearly 10 miles from where I should have been, in a section of the national forest rarely visited by hikers. I told the authorities a sanitized version of events, that I'd gotten turned around, panicked, and fell into the river. They nodded sympathetically, chalking it up to an inexperienced hiker making rookie mistakes. But I knew the truth. Something was out there in those mountains. Something that defied explanation. As I was discharged from the hospital, the doctor handed me a small plastic bag. "We found this clutched in your hand when they brought you in," he said. "Thought you might want it back." Inside was a tuft of coarse, dark fur, matted and muddy, but unmistakably real. Proof that I hadn't imagined it all. I've never gone back to those mountains. But sometimes, on dark nights when the wind howls outside my window, I remember those eyes in the forest, and I wonder if, somewhere out there, it remembers me too. Story 19. I've led countless bear-watching tours through Yellowstone, but nothing could have prepared me for what we encountered that fateful night. They say nature is red in tooth and claw, but what we witnessed went beyond nature. It was a reminder that in the wild, we're not always at the top of the food chain. "All right, folks, gather round," I called out to the small group of eager tourists. "Before we head out, let's go over some ground rules." 6 pairs of eyes looked back at me, a mix of excitement and nervousness evident on their faces. I'd seen that look 100 times before. City folk, most of them, thrilled at the prospect of seeing a real live bear in its natural habitat, but also acutely aware of the potential danger. "First and foremost, we stick together," I said, my voice taking on the authoritative tone I'd perfected over years of guiding. "No wandering off, no matter what you think you see. Bears may look cuddly, but they're wild animals and demand our respect. We'll be observing from a safe distance." I went on to cover the basics: how to use bear spray, what to do if we encounter a bear on the trail, the importance of securing food, the usual spiel. As I talked, I couldn't shake a nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach. Something felt off, but I pushed the thought aside, probably just first tour jitters. It had been a long winter, after all. "Any questions?" I asked, finishing up my safety talk. A hand shot up immediately. It belonged to a middle-aged woman with a camera that probably cost more than my monthly salary. "Is it true there have been increased bear attacks in the park recently?" she asked, a hint of worry in her voice. I hesitated for a moment. There had been rumors circulating among the park staff, unusual animal behavior, unexplained livestock deaths in the surrounding areas, but nothing concrete. "Ma, there's always a slight uptick in bear activity this time of year as they come out of hibernation," I said carefully. "But as long as we follow proper safety protocols, we'll be just fine. Now, let's hit the trail." We set off into the gathering dusk, the golden light of sunset filtering through the pines. It was a beautiful evening, crisp and clear, perfect conditions for wildlife viewing. As we hiked, I pointed out various plants and animal signs, keeping up a steady stream of information to distract from the growing darkness. About an hour in, we reached the observation point. It was a small clearing on a rise, offering a good view of a meadow below, where bears often came to graze in the evenings. I helped everyone set up their cameras and binoculars, then settled in to wait. The minutes ticked by. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink before fading to a deep purple. Still no bears. I could sense the group growing restless. "Sometimes it takes a while," I said, trying to keep their spirits up. "Wildlife doesn't run on a schedule, but trust me, the wait will be worth it when—" I cut off abruptly as movement caught my eye. There, at the edge of the meadow, a large, dark shape emerging from the tree line. "Look there," I whispered, pointing. Excited murmurs rippled through the group as cameras started clicking. But as I raised my own binoculars, my blood ran cold. Something wasn't right. The shape was too big for a black bear, and its movements were off. It loped across the meadow with an unnatural gait, almost like it was walking on its hind legs. Before I could process what I was seeing, a blood-curdling scream split the night. An elk burst from the trees, running full tilt across the meadow, and behind it, I blinked hard, sure I must be seeing things. The creature pursuing the elk was like nothing I'd ever encountered. It ran on all fours, but its body was all wrong. Too long, too lean to be a bear, and fast, impossibly fast. In a matter of seconds, it overtook the elk. What happened next will haunt me for the rest of my days. The creature didn't kill its prey like a normal predator. It tore into it, ripped it apart with a savagery that defied description. The sounds that echoed across the meadow were like nothing I'd ever heard before. "Oh my God!" someone in our group whimpered. "What is that thing?" I didn't have an answer. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Some kind of mutant bear. A wolf on steroids. Nothing added up. "We need to go," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Now." Quietly, we began to back away from the clearing, eyes locked on the grisly scene below. But we'd only gone a few steps when the creature's head snapped up. Even from this distance, I could see its eyes gleaming in the moonlight. It let out a low, rumbling growl that seemed to vibrate the very air around us. It had spotted us. "Run!" I yelled, all thoughts of quiet evacuation forgotten. "Back to the trail! Go!" Panic set in as our group fled through the darkened forest. I could hear branches snapping behind us, growing closer with each passing second. Whatever that thing was, it was fast, and it was coming for us. I brought up the rear, urging the others on. "Keep moving! Don't look back!" But humans are no match for a determined predator in the wild. I heard a scream and turned to see the woman with the expensive camera stumble and fall. Without thinking, I rushed to her side. "Come on," I said, hauling her to her feet. "We're almost there." That's when I saw it. The creature burst through the underbrush, a massive, dark shape silhouetted against the night sky. Up close, it was even more terrifying. It stood on two legs, towering over us at easily 8 feet tall. But its body was wrong, a twisted mix of bear and wolf with long, wickedly curved claws, its eyes locked onto mine, and in that moment, I knew we were going to die. This wasn't an animal acting on instinct. There was an intelligence in those eyes, a malevolence that froze me to the spot, just as it tensed to spring. A piercing whistle cut through the night. The creature's head snapped towards the sound. Another whistle, and to my utter amazement, it turned and loped off into the darkness. I stood there gasping for breath, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. The woman beside me was sobbing quietly. In the distance, I could hear the rest of the group calling out for us. "Are you okay?" I asked, helping her to her feet. She nodded wordlessly, her eyes wide with shock. We made our way back to the others, who were huddled together on the main trail. As we approached, I could see the fear and confusion on their faces. "What was that thing?" someone asked. "I've never seen anything like it." I opened my mouth to respond, but found I had no words. How could I explain something I didn't understand myself? "Let's just focus on getting back to the lodge," I said finally. We can figure it out there." The hike back was tense, every snapping twig and rustle of leaves setting us on edge, but we made it without further incident. As we emerged from the tree line into the safety of the lodge's floodlights, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders, but the relief was short-lived. As I ushered the group inside, I caught sight of a park ranger heading our way. The grim look on his face told me this wasn't over. Dave," he said, pulling me aside, "we need to talk." Over the next hour, I learned that we weren't the first to encounter whatever that thing was. There had been other sightings, livestock mutilations in nearby ranches, even a few missing hikers. The Park Service had been keeping it quiet to avoid panic, but things were escalating. "What do you think it is?" I asked, my voice low to avoid being overheard by the still-shaken tourists. The ranger shook his head. "I don't know. Some kind of undiscovered predator. A genetic experiment gone wrong. Hell, maybe all those Bigfoot nuts were onto something after all." I thought back to those intelligent, malevolent eyes. Somehow, I doubted any of those explanations fit. "Whatever it is," the ranger continued, "it's not natural, and it's not afraid of humans. We're bringing in some experts, but until then, all tours are suspended." I nodded, relief mixing with a strange sense of disappointment. Part of me, the part that had driven me to become a guide in the first place, wanted to go back out there. To understand, as I headed to my cabin that night, I paused at the edge of the forest. The trees seemed to loom larger than ever, the shadows between them deeper and more menacing. I thought I caught a flicker of movement, heard the faintest growl on the wind. I hurried inside, locking the door behind me. As I lay in bed that night, unable to sleep, one thought kept running through my mind. In all my years in the wilderness, I'd always felt at home, but now, for the first time, I realized that we were the intruders here, and something out there wanted us gone. The next morning, I woke to news that all civilian access to the park had been suspended indefinitely. Official reason: aggressive bear activity. But I knew the truth, and as I watched military helicopters flying in over the mountains, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Whatever was out there in those woods, it had changed everything. The wilderness I thought I knew was now a stranger to me, and I wasn't sure I'd ever look at it the same way again. Story 20. I've driven down countless dark, lonely roads in my life, but none quite like County Road 419. They say some paths are better left untraveled. I should have listened. What I encountered that night on that desolate stretch of asphalt has haunted me ever since, lurking in the shadows of my mind, like a predator waiting to strike. The rhythmic hum of tires on pavement had nearly lulled me to sleep when my headlights caught something in the road ahead. I blinked hard, forcing myself to focus. It had been a long day of driving, and the monotony of the nighttime forest pressing in on both sides of the narrow road was taking its toll. But no, I hadn't imagined it. There was definitely something there, a dark shape looming in the middle of my lane. I eased off the gas, squinting to make out what it could be. A fallen tree, maybe, or God forbid, a broken-down car. As I drew closer, the shape resolved itself into something else entirely, something that made my blood run cold. It was massive, easily 7 or 8 feet tall, and it was moving. I slammed on the brakes, my old sedan screeching in protest as it skidded to a halt mere feet from the thing. For a long moment, we just stared at each other, me white-knuckled on the steering wheel, heart pounding in my chest. And well, I'm still not sure what it was. In the harsh glare of my headlights, I could make out shaggy fur covering a body that seemed to be a twisted amalgamation of bear and man. But its face, God, its face, vaguely canine, with a long snout and pointed ears. But the eyes were the worst part. Intelligent, almost human, and filled with a malevolence that sent shivers down my spine. We must have stayed like that for only seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Then, with a grace that belied its massive size, the creature loped off into the woods. I sat there, gasping for breath, trying to process what I'd just seen. It couldn't be real. I was tired, my mind playing tricks on me. That had to be it. But as my racing heart began to slow, a new sound penetrated the quiet night, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. That's when I noticed my car wouldn't start. Panic clawed at my throat as I turned the key again and again, each attempt rewarded only with a sickening click. Come on, I muttered, desperation creeping into my voice. The growl came again, closer this time. I looked up, peering into the darkness beyond my headlights. Nothing but trees and shadows, but I could feel it out there, watching, waiting. I fumbled for my phone, cursing under my breath when I saw there was no signal. Of course, I was miles from the nearest town, surrounded by dense forest. I was on my own. Another growl, so close now it seemed to vibrate the very air around me, and with it, the unmistakable sound of heavy footfalls. Something was approaching, circling my stranded vehicle. I had to make a decision. Stay in the relative safety of my car and hope help somehow arrived, or make a run for it, hoping to find a house or at least a spot with cell reception. The decision was made for me when something slammed into the driver's side door, rocking the entire car. I caught a glimpse of gleaming claws and matted fur as the creature tried to force its way in. Pure instinct took over. I scrambled into the passenger seat and out the door, hitting the ground running. I had no idea which direction I was going. No plan beyond putting as much distance between myself and that thing as possible. The forest closed in around me as I crashed through the underbrush. Branches whipped at my face, roots seemed to reach up to trip me, but I didn't slow down. I could hear it behind me, heavy footfalls and the snap of branches as it gave chase. How long I ran, I couldn't say. Time lost all meaning in that frantic flight. My lungs burned, my legs screamed in protest, but the sound of pursuit kept me moving. Just when I thought I couldn't take another step, I burst through a thick stand of trees and found myself on the edge of a small clearing. And there, like a beacon of hope, was a cabin. Light spilled from its windows, promising safety and salvation. I sprinted towards it, shouting hoarsely, "Help, please, somebody help me!" The door flew open, revealing a grizzled old man holding a shotgun. His eyes widened as he took in my disheveled, terrified state. "Get inside, quick!" he barked, ushering me in and slamming the door behind us. I collapsed onto a worn sofa, gasping for breath. "What in God's name are you running from, boy?" the old man demanded, peering out a window into the darkness. Between ragged breaths, I tried to explain what I'd seen. The creature on the road, the attack on my car, the chase through the woods. With each word, I could see the color draining from the old man's face. "Oh, hell," he muttered. "It's back." Before I could ask what he meant, a bone-chilling howl split the night. It was close, too close. The old man sprang into action, moving with a speed that belied his age. He tossed me the shotgun and began pulling heavy wooden shutters closed over the windows. "Whatever happens," he said, his voice grim, "don't open that door, no matter what you hear." For the next several hours, we huddled in that cabin as something circled outside. We could hear it moving, testing the walls and door. Occasionally, it would let out that terrible howl, a sound that seemed to vibrate in my very bones. The old man, John, he eventually told me his name was, filled me in on what he knew, which wasn't much. The creature had been spotted in these woods for generations, he said. Most folks wrote it off as legend or the fevered imaginings of drunk hunters, but John knew better. He'd seen it himself, years ago, lost his wife to it. "A more ain't natural," he said, shaking his head. "Too smart for a regular animal, too mean for anything of this world." As the night wore on, the attacks on the cabin grew more frenzied. We could hear claws scraping against the walls, feel the whole structure shake as something massive hurled itself against the door. All we could do was wait, praying the old cabin would hold. Just when I thought the walls would surely give way, everything went quiet. The sudden silence was almost more unnerving than the attacks had been. We waited, barely breathing, for what felt like hours. Gradually, the first grey light of dawn began to filter through the cracks in the shutters. Only then did John cautiously open the door. The clearing around the cabin looked like a war zone. Deep claw marks scored the walls. The ground was torn up, trees at the edge of the clearing splintered and broken. But of the creature itself, there was no sign. "It'll be back," John said grimly. "Always comes back, but not in daylight, at least." He helped me back to my car, which miraculously started on the first try. As I prepared to leave, John pressed something into my hand, a small, crudely carved wooden figure. "Protection," he said, "passed down in my family for generations. Might not do a lick of good, but it can't hurt." I thanked him, not knowing what else to say. As I drove away, I could see him in my rearview mirror, a solitary figure standing guard against horrors I could scarcely comprehend. The official report chalked it up to a bear attack. My car had some damage consistent with a large animal collision, they said. The claw marks on John's cabin, probably just normal wear and tear on an old structure. They didn't say it outright, but I could see it in their eyes. They thought I was crazy, hysterical. Maybe they're right. God knows I've spent many sleepless nights since then, wondering if I imagined it all. But then I'll catch a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye, or hear a sound in the woods that's not quite natural, and I know it was real. It's still out there. I don't drive down lonely forest roads at night anymore. But sometimes, when the wind howls outside my window and the shadows grow long, I find myself clutching that little wooden figure John gave me. And I wonder, is it really just a superstitious trinket? Or is it the only thing standing between me and the horrors that lurk in the dark places of the world? One thing's for certain, I'll never look at the wilderness the same way again. There are things out there, in the shadows between the trees, that defy explanation. Things that remind us that for all our supposed dominion over nature, we're still just prey animals at heart. And sometimes, the hunter becomes the hunted. Story 21. I've always been drawn to the mysteries hidden beneath the earth. But after what happened in Stillwater Cave, I'm not sure I'll ever go underground again. Some secrets are better left buried, some depths better left unplumbed. We thought we were explorers. We didn't realize we were prey. You ready for this, little bro? Tyler's voice echoed off the limestone walls as he adjusted his helmet lamp. His excitement was palpable, infectious even. I grinned back at him, trying to ignore the knot of anxiety in my stomach. Born ready, I replied, double-checking my own gear. Let's make history. We'd been planning this expedition for months. Stillwater Cave was legendary among the caving community. A vast, largely unexplored system with rumors of massive chambers and underground rivers. Tyler and I had been mapping its outer sections for years, but today was different. Today, we were going deeper than anyone had before. The mouth of the cave yawned before us, a dark maw in the mountainside that seemed to swallow the morning sunlight. I took a deep breath, savoring the crisp mountain air. It would be the last fresh air we'd taste for hours. Remember, Tyler said as we approached the entrance, we stick together, no matter what. I nodded solemnly. Cave exploration was dangerous enough without taking unnecessary risks. We'd heard too many stories of overconfident cavers getting separated and lost in the labyrinthine passages. Some were never found. The transition from daylight to the absolute darkness of the cave was always jarring. One moment we were in the sun-dappled forest. The next, we were enveloped in a blackness so complete it felt like a physical presence. Our helmet lamps cut weak swaths through the gloom, revealing glistening rock formations and the occasional bat clinging to the ceiling. For the first few hours, everything went according to plan. We made our way deeper into the cave system, marking our path and taking careful notes on the geology. It was slow going. Some passages required us to crawl on our bellies through tight squeezes. Others involved precarious climbs down slippery rock faces. But we were making progress. It was when we reached the edge of the known map that things started to get weird. "Check this out," Tyler called, his voice tinged with excitement. He was examining a narrow fissure in the cave wall, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. I don't remember seeing this on any of the surveys. I consulted our map, frowning. He was right. This passage wasn't documented. Could be a new discovery, I said, trying to keep the unease out of my voice. Something about that dark crack in the rock made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Tyler was already shining his light into the opening, peering into the darkness beyond. "I think it opens up on the other side. We should check it out." I hesitated. We were already deeper than we'd planned to go on this trip. Exploring an unknown passage could be risky, but the lure of discovery was strong, and Tyler's enthusiasm was hard to resist. "All right," I said finally, "but we're careful," and we turned back at the first sign of trouble. Tyler nodded eagerly, already working to squeeze his way through the narrow opening. I followed, the rough stones scraping against my back as I inched through. The passage did indeed open up on the other side, widening into a decent-sized chamber. But as our light swept across the space, we both froze. The floor was littered with bones. Not the small, scattered remains you might expect to find in a cave, bat skeletons or the odd raccoon that had wandered in and gotten lost. These were big. Some looked disturbingly human. "What the hell?" Tyler muttered, crouching to examine a particularly large skull. Alex, are you seeing this?" I nodded mutely, my eyes fixed on the far wall of the chamber. There, barely visible in the weak light of our lamps, were paintings, crude images drawn in what looked disturbingly like dried blood. They depicted tall, misshapen figures with elongated limbs and canine-like heads. "We need to go," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Now." But before Tyler could respond, a low, rumbling growl echoed through the chamber. It wasn't the growl of any animal I'd ever heard. It was deeper, more guttural, and it was close. We both whirled towards the sound, our lights dancing wildly across the rocky walls. For a split second, I thought I saw something, a flash of movement in the shadows, a glimpse of matted fur and gleaming eyes, but it was gone so quickly I couldn't be sure. "Run!" Tyler yelled, already sprinting towards the narrow fissure we'd entered through. I was right behind him, heart pounding in my chest. We hit the opening at full speed, but immediately ran into a problem. In our panic, we'd forgotten how tight the squeeze was. Tyler managed to force his way through, but I got stuck halfway, my backpack wedged tight against the rock. "Tyler!" I called out, my voice high with fear. "I'm stuck!" I could hear him on the other side, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Hold on, I'll pull you through." He grabbed my outstretched hands, straining to drag me forward, but it was no use. I was wedged too tightly. That's when I heard it again, that inhuman growl, so close now it seemed to vibrate the very air around me, and with it, the unmistakable sound of claws scraping on stone. "Tyler, go!" I yelled, terror overwhelming any thoughts of self-preservation. "Get out of here!" "No way!" he shouted back, still pulling at my arms. "I'm not leaving you!" But even as he spoke, I felt something grab my legs. Something with incredible strength. It began to pull me back into the chamber. What happened next is a blur in my memory. Somehow, through sheer desperation and adrenaline, I managed to wriggle free of my pack. Tyler gave one final heave, and I popped through the fissure like a cork from a bottle. We ran. Blind panic drove us forward through the twisting passages of the cave. Our lights bounced crazily off the walls, creating a disorienting strobe effect. More than once, we took wrong turns, having to backtrack as the sounds of pursuit grew closer. I don't know how long we ran. Time lost all meaning in that frantic flight. Our lungs burned, our legs screamed in protest. But the sound of heavy footfalls behind us kept us moving. Just when I thought we couldn't go on, we rounded a corner and saw it. Daylight, the cave entrance, impossibly far away but unmistakable. With a final burst of speed, we sprinted for the opening. The growls and sounds of pursuit faded as we neared the surface. It was as if whatever was chasing us couldn't, or wouldn't, follow us into the light. We burst out of the cave, collapsing onto the forest floor. For long moments, we just lay there, gasping for air, unable to believe we'd made it. Finally, Tyler spoke, his voice hoarse. What the hell was that?" I shook my head, still struggling to process what had happened. "I don't know, but we're never going back in there again." We made our way back to civilization in a daze. Our story was met with skepticism by the local authorities. They sent a team to investigate, but found nothing out of the ordinary. The chamber with the bones and paintings seemed to have vanished, the narrow fissure now just a solid rock face. Most people chalked it up to an overactive imagination, a case of cave fever brought on by the darkness and isolation. But Tyler and I know what we saw, what we heard, what chased us. I still have nightmares about it. In the darkest hours of the night, I'll wake up in a cold sweat, convinced I can hear that inhuman growl echoing in the distance. I'll catch glimpses of movement in the shadows, flashes of gleaming eyes and matted fur. We never went caving again after that day. Some mysteries, we learned, are better left unsolved. Some depths are not meant to be plumbed by human explorers. But sometimes, on quiet nights, I find myself staring at the mountains in the distance, and I wonder, what's out there, lurking in the darkness beneath the earth? What ancient, forgotten things have we disturbed? And more chillingly, are they still down there, waiting, watching, hungry? One thing's for certain, I'll never look at a cave the same way again. What once seemed like gateways to adventure now feel like portals to a darker, more primordial world. A world where humans are not the apex predators, where nightmares take physical form. And sometimes, in my darkest moments, I can't shake the feeling that we didn't really escape that day, that whatever was down there in Stillwater Cave is still out there, somewhere, waiting, and that someday, somehow, it will find us again. Story 22. I've spent my entire career studying wolves, but nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered in the remote wilderness of northern Minnesota. They say when you stare into the abyss stares back. But what happens when the abyss not only stares back but hunts you? I went into those woods to observe. I left knowing what it feels like to be prey. The first light of dawn was just beginning to filter through the pines as I made my final checks on the trail camera. It was the last in a network of high-tech surveillance equipment I'd spent the past week setting up throughout this secluded valley. If my theories were correct, this area was home to a pack of wolves, unlike any previously documented. "All set, girl?" I asked, glancing down at Luna, my faithful husky. She wagged her tail in response, clearly eager to head back to our camp for breakfast. I couldn't blame her. We'd been out since before first light, and the crisp autumn air had a bite to it that hinted at the harsh winter to come. Still, I couldn't help but linger a moment, taking in the raw beauty of my surroundings. The mist rising off the nearby lake, the vibrant reds and golds of the changing leaves, the absolute stillness broken only by the occasional bird call. This was why I became a wildlife biologist, to immerse myself in nature, to unlock its secrets. And if my hunch about this particular pack of wolves was correct, I might be on the verge of a breakthrough that could rewrite our understanding of canine evolution. As we made our way back to camp, I ran through my mental checklist. Cameras were all in place, set to capture both still images and video. Audio recorders were strategically positioned to pick up howls and other vocalizations. And I had my own field equipment ready for direct observations. Now all I needed was for the wolves to cooperate. The next few days fell into a comfortable routine. Mornings were spent checking and adjusting equipment, afternoons dedicated to quiet observation from my camouflaged blind, evenings analyzing the day's data. Luna was a constant companion, her keen senses often alerting me to wildlife I might have otherwise missed. It was on the fourth night that things took a turn for the strange. I was reviewing footage from one of the trail cams when something caught my eye. At first, I thought it was just a glitch in the image, a strange blur of movement at the edge of the frame. But as I zoomed in and enhanced the image, my blood ran cold. There, just barely visible in the shadows, was a shape. It was large, easily the size of a wolf, but the proportions were off. The legs seemed too long, the body too lean, and its eyes, even in the grainy night vision footage, they seemed to glow with an unnatural intelligence. "What the hell are you?" I muttered, leaning in closer to the screen. As if in response, a howl echoed across the valley. Luna's head snapped up, her ears perked forward, but this was no ordinary wolf howl. It was deeper, more guttural, with harmonics I'd never heard before in all my years of research. I scrambled for my audio equipment, desperate to capture the sound, but as quickly as it had started, the howl cut off, leaving behind an eerie silence. Sleep was impossible after that. I spent the rest of the night poring over my data, searching for any other signs of the strange creature. There were a few more fleeting glimpses, a shadow here, a blur of movement there, but nothing concrete enough to draw any conclusions. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, I made a decision. I needed to see this thing for myself. Grabbing my gear and with Luna at my side, I set out toward the area where the camera had captured the anomalous footage. The morning mist clung to the ground, turning the familiar landscape into something alien and foreboding. We walked for hours, following game trails and checking my other cameras along the way, but there was no sign of the creature, no trace of anything out of the ordinary. It was late afternoon when Luna suddenly froze, her hackles rising. A low growl rumbled in her chest, a sound I'd never heard from her before. "What is it, girl?" I whispered, my hand instinctively going to the canister of bear spray on my belt. That's when I saw it, just a flicker of movement in my peripheral vision. I whirled around, my heart pounding in my chest. For a split second, I caught a glimpse of something moving through the underbrush, something big, but it was gone so quickly I couldn't be sure of what I'd seen. "Hello!" I called out, immediately regretting the decision. If this was a normal wolf, my voice would likely scare it off, and if it wasn't, well, I didn't want to think about that. Silence was my only reply, but it was a heavy silence, pregnant with tension. I could feel eyes on me, watching from the shadows. "Let's go, Luna," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Time to head back to camp. We hadn't gone more than a few steps when I heard it, a low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Luna whined, pressing herself against my leg. I quickened my pace, my eyes darting from tree to tree, searching for the source of the sound. The growl came again, closer this time, and with it the unmistakable sound of something large moving through the underbrush. That's when I made a crucial mistake. I ran. In an instant, the forest erupted into chaos. I could hear it behind me, heavy footfalls and the snap of branches as something gave chase. Luna ran ahead, leading the way back towards our camp. I've never run so hard in my life. My lungs burned, my legs screamed in protest. But the sound of pursuit kept me moving. Whatever was behind me, it was fast, and it was gaining. Just when I thought my legs would give out, I burst through a thicket and into the clearing where my research trailer was parked. I scrambled up the steps, Luna right behind me, and slammed the door shut. For long moments I stood there, gasping for breath, straining my ears for any sound of pursuit. But there was nothing, just the usual sounds of the forest and my own ragged breathing. As my pulse slowly returned to normal, I tried to make sense of what had just happened. What had I seen out there? What had chased me? It couldn't have been a normal wolf. It was too big, too fast. I spent a sleepless night in the trailer, jumping at every sound. When morning came, I cautiously ventured out to check the perimeter. What I found chilled me to the bone. Huge, misshapen tracks circled the trailer. They were vaguely canine in shape, but much too large for any wolf I'd ever encountered. And there was something off about their structure, the positioning of the toes, the depth of the claw marks. It was as if something had taken the basic template of a wolf's paw and twisted it into something other. As I stood there, staring at the tracks, a twig snapped in the forest behind me. I whirled around, my heart leaping into my throat. There, at the edge of the clearing, stood the creature I'd been seeking. For a moment I could only stare, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. It was huge, easily 7 feet tall at the shoulder. Its body was lean and muscular, covered in shaggy dark fur, but it wasn't a wolf, at least not any wolf I'd ever seen. It stood on 2 legs, its front limbs ending in wickedly curved claws. Its face was a nightmarish blend of wolf and something almost human, with intelligent eyes that seemed to bore right through me. For what felt like an eternity, we just stared at each other. I was rooted to the spot, equal parts terrified and awestruck. This was the discovery of a lifetime, a creature that, by all rights, shouldn't exist. Then it took a step forward, and the spell was broken. I scrambled back into the trailer, slamming and locking the door behind me. Through the small window, I could see it approaching, its movements a fluid grace that belied its massive size. It circled the trailer, occasionally rising up on its hind legs to peer in through the windows. I could hear its breathing, deep and ragged, smell its wild, musky scent. It was testing the structure, searching for a way in. I don't know how long this standoff lasted. Hours, maybe. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the clearing, the creature finally retreated back into the forest, but I knew it wasn't gone. I could feel its presence out there, watching, waiting. That night, as I huddled in my bunk with Luna pressed close, I came to a chilling realization. I hadn't been studying these creatures. They had been studying me. All my cameras, my surveillance equipment, they had allowed it, perhaps even used it to learn about me. The hunter had become the hunted. I radioed for extraction the next morning, citing equipment failure as the reason for cutting my research short. I couldn't bring myself to reveal the truth. Who would believe me? And more importantly, what would happen if people came looking for these creatures? As the helicopter lifted me out of that remote valley, I looked down at the vast expanse of wilderness below. Somewhere down there, those creatures were watching, waiting. I thought about the data still out there on my equipment, the evidence of something that could revolutionize our understanding of evolution and cryptozoology. But some discoveries come at too high a price. Some secrets are better left uncovered. I've spent my career trying to understand the natural world, but now I realize there are depths to nature that humans were never meant to plumb. I still dream about those intelligent eyes, that primal power. And I wonder, how many other secrets are out there in the wild places of the world? How many other impossible creatures are watching us from the shadows, waiting for us to stumble into their domain? One thing's for certain, I'll never look at the wilderness the same way again, because now I know that sometimes, when you go into the forest to observe, you may find yourself becoming the subject of a much more ancient and terrifying study.